Tonight, we explore a different fate for Lord Eddard Stark, a world where the sword never fell in King's Landing, and Ned was allowed to take the black instead. Stripped of his titles, separated from his family, and sent north to the Wall, Ned Stark would enter the Night's Watch as a broken man carrying the truth of Joffrey's throne, the weight of his honor, and the knowledge that winter was coming. What if Ned Stark took the black? Not the version he wanted, not the honorable retirement, not the voluntary sacrifice of a man choosing the Watch, because the Watch was noble and the cause was just. The other version, the ugly version, the version where the taking was not a choice but a sentence, where the black was not a calling but a cage, where the man wearing it was not a volunteer but a prisoner whose prison happened to be 700 feet of ice at the edge of the world. Ned Stark took the black because the alternative was his head on a spike. That was the deal, the only deal, offered by Varys in a cell that smelled like old water and fear, delivered with the specific smooth practicality of a man who dealt in survival the way merchants dealt in goods. Here is the price. Here is the product. Take it or don't. The market closes at dawn. Confess. Say you plotted against the throne. Say you were wrong. Take the black. Your daughters live. Your son stops his march. The realm doesn't burn. Ned had refused. For 2 days he had refused, because confessing to a crime he hadn't committed was the opposite of everything Ned Stark was, and Ned Stark was not a man who became the opposite of himself easily. He was not a man who became the opposite of himself at all. That was the whole point of Ned Stark. The reason people followed him. The reason Robert had loved him. The reason the North trusted him. He was the thing he appeared to be. Not more, not less. The same all the way down. Confessing meant stop being that thing. Not confessing meant Sansa, Arya, his girls in the Red Keep, in Cersei's hands, in the specific, dangerous proximity of a queen whose power depended on the lie that Ned had tried to expose, and who would use every tool available, including the tools that were his daughters, to maintain the lie. Ned confessed, not for himself, never for himself. He would have died on the steps of the Sept of Baelor with the truth in his mouth and the sword coming down and the specific, stark certainty that death with honor was preferable to life without it. He would have died. That was the easy choice. The hard choice was live, lie, lose everything, the name, the titles, the North, the lordship, the 15 years of marriage and the household and the reputation and the specific identity that had been his since birth. Lose all of it, keep breathing, and go to the Wall. He made the hard choice. This is the story of what the hard choice produced. The Sept of Baelor, 298 AC. The crowd was enormous. This was the thing Ned noticed first, not the smell of King's Landing, hot stone, bodies, the specific metropolitan stink of 500,000 people generating effluvia in insufficient drainage. Not the sun in his eyes after weeks in the black cells, not the guards' hands on his arms or the chains on his wrists. The crowd. Thousands of people assembled to watch him confess, packed into the plaza before the Sept of Baelor with the focused attention of an audience that had paid nothing for admission and was expecting everything from the performance. They wanted blood. He could feel it, the specific electrical charge of a crowd that had been told a traitor was going to confess, and that had come for the spectacle. And that would be satisfied by the confession only if the confession was dramatic enough to justify the walking and the standing, and the specific investment of a morning's labor that watching a public humiliation required. The steps, marble, white, hot in the sun, the high septon in his crystal crown, Cersei on the gallery, golden, composed, wearing the expression of a woman who had won and who was performing the winning with the specific theatrical grace that Cersei applied to all her victories. which was enough to communicate triumph without enough to invite accusations of gloating. Joffrey was beside her, 12 years old, blonde, the face that Ned now knew was not Robert's face, the face that was Jaime's, the face that was the evidence of the crime that had put Ned in chains and that was now sitting on the gallery wearing a crown that didn't belong to it. Sansa was on the steps. Ned saw her, and the seeing was a blade. 11 years old. Her face was. She had been crying. The remnants were on her cheeks, the salt tracks that King's Landing heat dried fast but not fast enough. She was standing where they'd placed her with the specific frozen posture of a child who had been told what was going to happen and who was managing the happening through the only tool available, which was immobility. Don't move. Don't flinch. Don't give them anything. She looked like her mother. Ned walked to the platform. The guards released his arms. He stood alone before the crowd and the sept and the gods, the 7 that Catelyn worshipped, the gods he didn't believe in and that were going to witness his confession regardless of his belief. He opened his mouth. The words were, they had been prepared. Varys had given him the text. The specific language of confession that the crown required. I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell. I come before you to confess my treason. I plotted to seize the Iron Throne. I was wrong. He said the words. Each one cost him something. The specific currency of self-respect, spent word by word. The account that had been full his entire life draining in real time before a crowd that didn't know the account existed and wouldn't have cared if it did. He said the words, and the crowd listened, and the crowd was not satisfied. Not entirely. The confession was the appetizer. The crowd wanted the main course. The crowd wanted to know what happened next. Joffrey stood, the boy king, 12 years old. The crown sitting on his head the way crowns sat on heads that were too young for them, slightly wrong, slightly tilted. The specific visual evidence of authority placed on a vessel that couldn't hold it. My mother wishes me to let Lord Eddard join the Night's Watch. The crowd's noise, a rumble, the specific sonic wave of thousands of people reacting simultaneously. Stripped of all titles and powers, he would serve the realm in permanent exile. Ned held still. He thought, this is the deal. This is what Varys promised. The black, not the block. The wall, not the sword. Joffrey looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at Joffrey. The moment balanced on the edge of a decision that a 12-year-old was about to make. A 12-year-old with a crown and a grudge and the specific dangerous combination of power and immaturity that had, throughout history, produced catastrophic decisions. The moment tipped. So long as I am your king, treason shall never go unpunished. Cerilyn, Ned's blood went cold. Cersei moved. On the gallery, the specific sharp movement of a mother seeing her child deviate from the script and reaching for the correction. Joffrey, bring me his head. The crowd roared. But Cersei was already moving. Cersei was. And this was the thing that changed everything. The thing that in another version of this story didn't happen, because in another version Cersei hesitated half a second too long. Cersei was at Joffrey's side. You will honor the agreement. Her voice was low, and it was iron, and it was directed at her son with the specific force that only Cersei could generate. The concentrated maternal authority of a woman who loved her children with a ferocity that bordered on psychosis, and who was now deploying that ferocity to prevent her eldest from making a mistake that would start a war. He's a traitor. He is going to the wall. That is the agreement. That is what we announced. If you change the sentence now, in front of the city, in front of the court, in front of the faith, you tell every lord in the 7 kingdoms that the crown's word is meaningless. She gripped his arm. You tell Robb Stark, who has 20,000 men in the Riverlands, that his father's life is forfeit regardless of what we promised. You tell the North to march on King's Landing. She leaned close. The wall. Joffrey. The wall. He spends the rest of his life in frozen exile. That is worse than death for a man like Ned Stark. Let him have it. Joffrey's face, the 12-year-old calculation, the specific process of a boy weighing his desire for violence against his mother's political assessment and finding in the weighing that his mother's assessment was louder than his desire. Not because the assessment was correct, because Cersei's grip on his arm was tight enough to hurt. The Night's Watch. Joffrey said it to the crowd, to the court, to the specific assembled witness of King's Landing. Lord Eddard Stark will take the Black. He will serve at the Wall until the end of his days. All titles, all lands, all claims are forfeit. The crowd made a noise. Not the noise they'd wanted to make, not the roar of a crowd that got its blood. The noise was lesser. The specific, disappointed deflation of an audience that had been promised the main course and received the appetizer, and that was now trying to decide whether the appetizer was sufficient. Ned stood on the steps. He was alive. He was alive, and he was stripped of everything. The name, still Stark, but without the lordship. The lands, Winterfell would go to Robb. The titles, Lord of Nothing. The marriage, the Watch took no wives. The children, the Watch claimed no children. Everything that had been Ned Stark was gone. What remained was a man in chains on marble steps who had just confessed to a crime he didn't commit in exchange for his life and his daughter's safety. He looked at Sansa. She was crying. The immobility had broken, the specific fracture that happened when a child's control exceeded its capacity, and the exceeded capacity produced tears rather than movement. He tried to catch her eye. She wouldn't look at him. He was taken from the steps. Down, into the cart that would carry him north, into the chains that would hold him during the journey, into the specific, ugly machinery of a kingdom processing a prisoner whose processing was the price of peace. He went north. He didn't look back at King's Landing. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. The Road. 298 AC. The journey from King's Landing to the Wall took 31 days. Ned made it in a cage on the back of a wagon with 6 other prisoners, men who had been sentenced to the Watch for crimes that ranged from murder to theft to the specific catch-all category of being in the wrong place when the wrong lord needed someone to blame. The prisoners were a rapist from Flea Bottom, a horse thief from the Crownlands, 2 brothers who had killed a tax collector. The tax collector had been stealing. This was not considered a defense. A boy of 16 who had been caught poaching on a lord's lands, and Ned Stark, former Lord of Winterfell, former Hand of the King, former Warden of the North. The rapist recognized him. "You're the Hand, the one who, you're Stark." Was Stark. Was the Hand, still Stark. The name doesn't come off. The rapist looked at him with the specific recalculation that happened when a man who had been sentenced for a terrible crime discovered he was sharing a cage with a man who had been sentenced for a larger one. The recalculation produced a kind of respect, not the respect of equals, the respect of hierarchy. Even in a cage, the hierarchy existed. Ned Stark in chains was still more significant than a rapist in chains, and the significance communicated itself through the posture and the voice and the specific gravity of a man who had been important and who carried the importance the way amputees carried phantom limbs. The thing was gone, but the shape of it remained. The road north was the King's Road, which Ned had travelled 6 times in his life, to King's Landing for Robert's Court, back north to Winterfell, the specific, well-worn route of a man who served his king from a distance, and who preferred the distance. He knew the road, the inns, the crossings, the way the landscape changed as you moved north. The Crownlands giving way to the Riverlands, the Riverlands giving way to the Neck giving way to the North, and the North giving way to the true North. The territory beyond Winterfell, where the cold stopped being weather and started being geography. He passed Winterfell. Not through it, past it. The wagon took the road that skirted the castle, close enough that Ned could see the walls in the distance, the grey stone, the hot spring steam rising from the towers. Close enough that if someone on the walls had been looking, if Catelyn or Robb or Bran or Rickon had been looking, they would have seen a wagon on the road and would not have known that the man in the cage was the man who had built their lives. Nobody was looking. Robb was south. Robb had called the banners. Ned learned this from the guards, who talked among themselves with the specific, casual information sharing of men who didn't consider their prisoner important enough to keep secrets from. 50,000 Northerners were marching south to rescue Ned Stark. 50,000 men who didn't know that Ned Stark was in a cage on the King's Road, heading in the opposite direction from the rescue. Catelyn was. Ned didn't know where Catelyn was. The guards didn't know. The information was fragmented, the wartime fog that turned facts into rumors, and rumors into the specific, confusing noise of a kingdom at war, when nobody knew the full picture, because the full picture was too large and too fast for any single perspective to contain. He thought about Catelyn. He thought about her the way he thought about everything he'd lost, thoroughly, methodically, with the specific Ned Stark approach to grief that was not theatrical but structural, the grief built into the architecture of the man rather than performed on the surface. He thought about 15 years of marriage, about the specific daily intimacy of sharing a bed and a household and 5 children, and the particular way Catelyn smelled in the morning before the day had started, and the household had demanded her, and she was still, for a few minutes, in the grey pre-dawn of a northern bedroom, just Cat. He was never going to see her again. The Watch took no wives. The Watch claimed no families. Ned Stark would stand on the wall and look south and know that the woman he loved was 800 miles away, and that the 800 miles was permanent. He accepted this. Not easily. Not with the graceful resignation that songs attributed to noble exiles. With the ugly, grinding, teeth-clenching acceptance of a man who had no alternative, and who was processing the no alternative through the specific Ned mechanism of endurance, which was, keep going. Don't stop. The stopping is where the grief catches you. The wagon reached Castle Black on a Tuesday in late autumn. The wall was. Ned had seen the wall before. He'd been to Castle Black years ago to visit Benjen. But seeing the wall as a lord and seeing the wall as a prisoner were different experiences. As a lord, the wall was impressive. The engineering, the scale, the specific, ancient grandeur of a structure that had been standing for 8,000 years. As a prisoner, the wall was a wall. The specific kind of wall that prisons had. The kind that kept you in. The gate opened. The wagon passed through. Ned Stark entered Castle Black, and standing in the yard, in the specific grey-black uniform of a brother of the Night's Watch, with a sword at his hip and a direwolf at his feet, was Jon Snow. Castle Black. The arrival. 298 Eivor Thegissisi. Jon had heard the rumours. For weeks, the fragmentary reports that travelled north through the Watch's channels and the merchant routes and the specific slow information pipeline that connected the wall to the rest of the realm. His father arrested, his father accused of treason, his father in the black cells. Then, his father would take the black. Jon had received this information in the common hall at Castle Black, from a brother who had heard it from a trader who had heard it from a rider. The information was third-hand, unreliable, the kind of intelligence that the Watch dealt in constantly, and that was right approximately 60% of the time. He'd gone to Maester Aemon. Is it true? Aemon was in his cell, the dark, warm room where the blind old Maester spent his days, processing information from the realm through the specific sensory channels that blindness left open. Sound. Temperature. The emotional register of the people who came to him with their questions. Is what true? My father. The Wall. They say he's taking the Black. I've heard the reports. Is it true? I don't know if it's true, Jon. Ravens from the south have been inconsistent. The reports conflict. What I know is, something has happened in King's Landing. Your father was arrested. The outcome is, he paused. The specific Aemon pause that was not hesitation, but precision. The old man choosing words with the care that 100 years of using them had produced. Uncertain. Jon waited. He waited for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of uncertainty that operated on his emotional architecture, the way stress operated on stone, invisibly, continuously, producing fractures that weren't visible on the surface, but that weakened the structure. Then the wagon came. Jon was in the yard. He was always in the yard at this hour. The morning training session that was both his duty and his refuge. The place where the body's demands replaced the mind's, and where the specific grinding anxiety of not knowing could be replaced. For an hour, with the specific manageable challenge of swordwork. Ghost saw the wagon first. The direwolf was lying at the edge of the yard. The snow-white shape that the watch had learned to work around because the wolf was not moving, and the wolf's not moving, was the specific kind that communicated, I am here, and I will continue to be here, and your options are. Accept this. Ghost stood. Not alarmed, alert, the ears forward, the body orienting toward the gate. The wagon came through. Jon saw the prisoners. The cage, the specific visual register of a wagon load of men who had been sentenced and who were arriving at the place where the sentence would be served. He saw his father. Ned Stark in the cage, changed, thinner, greyer, the face carrying the weight of weeks in the black cells and the road north, and the specific physical deterioration that happened when a man who had been running a kingdom was reduced to a prisoner in a box. The clothes were wrong, not the northern clothes, not the stark grey. Something borrowed and stained from the journey. The hands were. The hands that had held ice, that had held the Stark sword, that had held Jon when Jon was small enough to be held. The hands were chained. Jon dropped his practice sword. The sound of the sword hitting the ground was loud in the yard. The specific metallic clatter that cut through the morning noise and that produced a silence. The watch's silence. The institutional quiet that happened when something unusual was occurring and the institution was processing the unusual. The cage was opened. The prisoners climbed out, slowly, stiffly, the movements of men who had been confined and who were rediscovering the specific physical vocabulary of bodies that could move in more than one direction. Ned climbed out. He stood in the yard at Castle Black, and he looked at Jon. Jon looked at him. The distance between them was 30 feet. The 30 feet of a training yard, the distance between the cage and the sword rack where Jon had been practicing. 30 feet that was also 15 years of a relationship that had been complicated and loving and dishonest in ways that Jon didn't know about yet, and that was now being renegotiated in real time, in public, in the yard of an institution that neither of them had expected to share. Jon crossed the yard. Not running, walking, the specific Jon walk that was controlled and purposeful and that communicated, I am managing what I feel. I am not letting what I feel manage me. The walk of a boy who had been told his entire life that he was a bastard and who had learned, through the telling, to manage his feelings publicly because public feelings were vulnerabilities and bastards couldn't afford. Vulnerabilities. He stopped in front of Ned. Father. The word. In this context, in the yard, with the watch around them, with the chains still on Ned's wrists and the cage still behind him, the word was both accurate and inadequate. Father. The man who had raised him. The man who had claimed him as his bastard. The man who had carried a secret about Jon's real parentage for 15 years, and who was now standing in the yard at Castle Black, carrying the secret into the same institution that Jon was serving. Ned looked at his boy. Not a boy anymore. Jon was taller, harder. The watch had been building him the way the watch built everyone who survived it, by removing the unnecessary and leaving the essential. Jon's face was leaner. The grey eyes, Lyanna's eyes, the eyes Ned saw every time he looked at Jon and that Jon didn't know were Lyanna's, were clearer. The specific, watchful quality that had always been Jon's had been refined by the watch into something sharper. Jon. The word was enough. Not the eloquent reunion that the situation deserved, not the speech, not the explanation, not the specific emotional reckoning that 15 years of lies and love and the complicated intertwining of both required. Just the name. Because Ned Stark was not a man who performed, and because Jon had been raised by a man who didn't perform, and because the performance would have been, in this moment, in this yard, with these men watching, a lie. And there had been enough lies. Jon embraced him. Brief. Tight. The specific physical communication of a boy who was not going to cry in the training yard of Castle Black, because crying in training yards was not what Watch Brothers did. And Jon was a Watch Brother. And the Brotherhood's code would be maintained even as the Brotherhood's newest recruit was the man Jon had spent his life calling father. Ned held on. For a moment. For the fraction of a moment that the holding could last before the holding became a display, and the display became a vulnerability, Ned held his son, his nephew, the child he'd claimed as his bastard and raised as his own, and who was standing in the yard in black, serving the watch that Ned was now joining. The specific, impossible coincidence of a father and a secret arriving at the same wall. They separated. Jon looked at the chains. "Get those off him." The guard who'd driven the wagon looked at Jon, looked at Ned. Made the calculation that watch recruits had to make when the power dynamics were unclear. Was the boy giving orders he was authorized to give? He's to be processed. He's to be unchained. He's not going to run. There's nowhere to run. Jon's voice had the quality it had when he was managing something larger than himself, the Stark quality, the specific inherited authority that Ned recognized because he'd given it to Jon without knowing he was giving it. The Lord Commander will process him. The chains come off. The chains came off. Ned rubbed his wrists. The specific gesture of a man feeling the absence of restraint and finding the absence almost as disorienting as the restraint itself. "Come inside," Jon said. "I'll take you to Mormont." "Jon, not now." Jon's voice, controlled, the specific emotional containment that Jon deployed when the emotions were too large for the container, and the container needed to hold anyway. "Not now. Later. We'll talk. There's a lot. But not in the yard." Ned nodded. They went inside. Ghost followed. Mormont. The Lord Commander's Assessment. 298 AC. Jean Mormont had been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch for 10 years, and in that time he had received every kind of man the realm produced: murderers, rapists, thieves, disgraced knights, deposed lords, boys sent by fathers who didn't want them. He had processed each arrival with the same assessment. What can you do? What will you cost me? And how long before the wall breaks you, or makes you? He had never received a hand of the king. Mormont sat behind his desk in the Lord Commander's quarters, a room that was warm by Castle Black standards, and freezing by any other. The fire burning in a hearth that consumed wood, the way the watch consumed men. Constantly, inadequately, with the awareness that the supply would eventually run out. The raven on his shoulder, the old bird, the one that said corn and king, and occasionally other words in combinations that were either random or prophetic, depending on how much you'd been drinking, watched Ned with one black eye. Lord Stark. Not a lord anymore. No, not anymore. Mormont looked at him. The assessment was happening. The specific Mormont evaluation that processed new recruits through the filter of 40 years of military command and that produced, within minutes, a classification that would determine how the recruit was used. Sit. Ned sat. You know this place? I visited Benjen years ago. Benjen is missing. Mormont said it flat. The way you delivered information that was devastating and that you'd been carrying long enough that the devastation had been compressed into a fact. Letter ranging beyond the wall. 6 months ago. Hasn't returned. Ned absorbed this. The absorption was visible. The specific physical registration of bad news in a man who had been receiving bad news for months and whose capacity for absorption was not exhausted but was approaching a limit. His brother. His last brother. Brandon dead in the Red Keep. Benjen missing beyond the wall. How many men? 6. Experienced rangers. All missing. Mormont reached for a cup. Drank, set it down. The wall has problems. Stark. Not the problems you're used to. Not politics. Not succession. Not the specific southern games that got you sent here. Real problems. The rangings are losing men. The cold is wrong. Directional. Organized. The wildlings are moving south, which is what wildlings do when something north of them is worse than the wall. The others. Mormont looked at him sharply. The old stories, Ned said. The reason the wall was built. The old stories are. Mormont stopped. Started again. 6 months ago I would have told you the old stories are stories. Today I'm not sure. The reports from the rangings, the ones that come back, describe things that the old stories describe. Cold that moves. Dead that walk. He held Ned's gaze. I have 800 men, 800, to hold a wall that was built for 10,000. Half of them are criminals who can barely hold a sword. The other half are old. What do you need? Men, weapons, supplies. The specific attention of a realm that has been ignoring the wall for 50 years because the wall's purpose was forgotten, and the forgetting was convenient. Mormont leaned forward. I need a man who can talk to kings, who can write letters that lords actually read, who can explain to the realm that the wall is not a dumping ground for their unwanted, but the only thing standing between civilization and whatever is building in the north. Ned looked at Mormont. I'm a recruit. I took the black under sentence. You're Ned Stark. You took the black under sentence, and you're still Ned Stark. The sentence strips your titles. It doesn't strip your mind. It doesn't strip the 15 years you spent running the largest kingdom in the realm. It doesn't strip the fact that every lord in the north respects you, and half the lords in the south do too. Mormont picked up a letter. This arrived yesterday. From Robb Stark, your son. He's called the Banners. 50,000 northerners are marching south. Ned closed his eyes. He's doing it for you. To rescue you. But you're already here. Which means those 20,000 men are marching for a rescue that doesn't need to happen. Mormont set the letter down. I need you to write to your son. Tell him you're alive. Tell him to stand down, and then tell him to send me 2,000 of those 20,000. Because whatever is building beyond the wall is going to be worse than whatever the Lannisters are doing in the south. Robb won't. He can't just stand down. Sansa and Arya are still in King's Landing. I know. The politics are complicated. Everything south of the neck is complicated. But you took the black. Stark, your war is here now. Not in the south. Here, he gestured at the wall, the 700-foot presence that was visible through the window, the ice catching the morning light with the specific blue-white luminescence that made the wall look less like a structure and more like a natural phenomenon. Whatever comes through that wall comes through all of us. And I need all of us ready. Ned looked at the wall. He thought about Robb, 16, leading an army, carrying the weight that Ned had carried for 15 years and that had been transferred to Robb's shoulders by the specific mechanism of Ned's arrest and confession and sentencing. Robb was. Ned knew this. Knew it with the certainty of a father who had watched his son grow, capable. Robb was charismatic and decisive, and occasionally reckless, which was the Stark-Tully combination that produced commanders who were beloved and effective, and who sometimes made decisions that prioritized glory over caution. He thought about Catelyn, managing Robb, managing the war, managing the specific catastrophe that Ned's arrest had produced in the family and the North and the realm. Catelyn was the best thing that had ever happened to the Stark family, and Ned had repaid her by getting arrested for telling the truth and confessing to a lie. And the repayment was the end of their marriage, because the Watch took no wives, and the taking was permanent. He thought about his daughters, Sansa and Arya, still in King's Landing, still in Cersei's proximity, still carrying the danger that Ned's confession was supposed to have mitigated, and that Ned's exile was supposed to have neutralized. He thought about Jon, standing somewhere in this castle, waiting for the conversation that Ned owed him, and that Ned was not ready for, because the conversation required telling Jon the truth about his mother, and the truth was a bomb that Ned had been carrying for 15 years, and that he was now going to detonate in an institution where bombs were especially destructive. "I'll write to Robb," Ned said. "Today. Today." And Stark, "What?" "Welcome to the Watch. It's going to be the worst thing that ever happened to you, until the thing north of the Wall gets here. Then the Watch is going to be the only thing that matters." Ned stood. "I know. You don't. Not yet. But you will." Ned as recruit. The first weeks. 228 AC. The Watch swore its recruits in a ceremony at the foot of the wall. Ned stood with the other recruits, the rapist, the horse thief, the brothers, the poaching boy. And he said the words. The ancient words. The specific formula that had been spoken by every man who joined the Watch for 8,000 years. The words that stripped everything and replaced it with duty. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. He said them, and the saying was different from what he expected. Not the solemn commitment that the words described, not the noble sacrifice of a man choosing the Watch, because the cause was righteous. The saying was, surrender. The specific emotional act of a man giving up the last pieces of himself that he'd been holding. The name, the family, the North, and letting the pieces go, because the alternative was holding pieces that he could never use again. "I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father, no children," he thought. Already done, already taken, already lost. "I am the sword in the darkness," he thought. "I am a man in a black cloak at the edge of the world, saying words I believe in a place I never expected to be." The ceremony ended. Ned was a brother of the Night's Watch. The first week was adjustment. Physical, logistical, the specific institutional onboarding that the Watch applied to all recruits, regardless of their previous station. Ned was assigned to the stewards, not the rangers, not the builders. The stewards. This was Mormont's decision, and it was deliberate. The stewards managed the Watch's administration, the supply chain, the communications, the specific bureaucratic infrastructure that kept an institution of 800 men functioning. Mormont wanted Ned's mind, not his sword. Ned accepted this. He accepted it because accepting was what the Watch required, and because Ned was, despite everything, despite the confession, despite the stripping, despite the specific humiliation of a man who had commanded armies being assigned to administrative duties, Ned was a soldier. Soldiers accepted assignments. The accepting was not agreement. The accepting was discipline. He wrote to Robb. The letter took 3 drafts. The first draft was emotional, the specific, raw outpouring of a father writing to a son for the first time since the arrest, the accumulated worry and love and grief that had been building for months pouring onto the page, with the specific lack of discipline that Ned applied to written communication when the communication was about feelings rather than facts. He burned the first draft. The second draft was strategic, the specific military communications of a commander advising a subordinate, the language clipped and functional and carrying the authority that Ned had been wielding for 15 years. But Ned was not Robb's commander anymore. Ned was a recruit at the Watch, and Robb was a lord leading an army, and the power dynamic had inverted, and the second draft didn't account for the inversion. He burned the second draft. The third draft was, honest, the most difficult register for Ned, which was the register where the truth was complicated and where the complication couldn't be resolved through either emotion or strategy, but required the specific, uncomfortable middle ground of a man being real with his son. Robb. I'm alive. I'm at Castle Black. I took the black. The confession was the price, and I paid it. The confession was a lie. I want you to know that. Everything I said on the steps of the Sept was false. I said it because Varys told me your sisters' lives depended on it, and because my pride wasn't worth their safety. You've called the banners. I know this. The Lord Commander showed me the reports. You're marching south with 20,000 men, and the question I need you to sit with, not answer immediately, sit with, is, what are you marching for? If the answer is, to rescue me, the rescue is done. I'm here. The price was everything I had, and the price was paid, and I'm alive. If the answer is, to free your sisters, then the march may be necessary. Sansa and Arya are in King's Landing. I don't know their situation. I don't know what Cersei will do now that I'm gone. The girls need protection, and if the march provides that protection, then march. But Robb, the Wall needs men. Whatever you do in the south, the Wall needs men. The Lord Commander has 800 brothers to hold a wall built for 10,000. The Rangings are losing men. The cold is wrong. Something is building in the north, and the something is more dangerous than anything in the south, because the something doesn't care about politics. I can't tell you what to do. I'm not your lord anymore. I'm your father. I'll always be your father. But I'm not your lord. The decisions are yours. Make them carefully. You're smarter than I am at politics. Use that. Don't be me. Don't tell the truth when the truth will get you killed. Tell the truth when the truth will get you results. That's a thing I never learned, and it cost me everything. The North remembers. Your father. He sent the letter. Then he sat in his cell, the small, cold room that was his now, the specific institutional housing of a watch brother that was not a prison cell, but that shared enough architectural DNA with a prison cell to make the distinction academic, and he waited for the response that would take weeks to arrive, and that would tell him whether his son was going to fight a war or come north. Ned and Jon. The first conversation, 298 AC. Or they talked on the third night. Not in the common hall, too public. Not in Jon's quarters, too small. On the wall itself. The top. 700 feet above the frozen landscape, with the wind cutting through their cloaks and the stars overhead, and the specific isolated privacy that the wall's top provided, which was, you could talk about anything up here because nobody could hear you, and the listening was the wind's, and the wind didn't care. Jon led the way up. The stairs, the wooden stairs bolted into the ice face, the specific engineering of a climbing structure that shouldn't have worked, and that did, because 8,000 years of maintenance had kept it functional. Ned climbed. His legs, weeks of cell and wagon, the atrophy that confinement produced, protested. He climbed anyway, because Jon was climbing and because keeping up with his son was the one competition Ned was not willing to lose. They reached the top. The view was, Ned had seen the view before, from Benjen's tours. But seeing the view as a visitor and seeing it as a brother were different experiences. As a visitor, the view was spectacular, the north stretching to infinity, white and empty, the specific, vast scale of a landscape that made human problems look small. As a brother, the view was a responsibility. Everything out there was his to watch, his to hold against, his to defend. Jon stood at the edge. Not the very edge, 3 feet back. The specific distance that experienced wall brothers maintained because the wind at the top was unpredictable and the drop was permanent. You confessed. I confessed. To treason. To treason I didn't commit. I know you didn't commit treason. Jon's voice was the wall, cold, flat, carrying weight without displaying it. Everyone knows the confession was theatre. The confession was the price for Sansa and Arya. Jon was quiet. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Not the public version, not the confession. What actually happened?" Ned told him. He told Jon about Jon Arryn's death, about the investigation, the lineages, the bastards, the Baratheon colouring, about Cersei's children, about the truth that Jon Arryn had been killed for discovering and that Ned had been arrested for confirming. He told Jon about Littlefinger's betrayal, the man Catelyn had trusted, the man who had smiled and offered help, and then shut the trap. He told Jon about the Black Cells, about Varys and the deal. He told Jon everything except the one thing that Jon had been waiting to hear his entire life, and that Ned had been carrying for 15 years, and that was sitting between them on the top of the wall, like a third person in the conversation. Jon heard the silence. "There's more. There's more. About me." Ned looked at his son, his nephew. The boy with Lyanna's eyes standing on the wall that would be his home for the rest of his life, asking the question that the boy had been asking in different forms since he was old enough to understand that something about his situation didn't make sense. "Not tonight, Father. Not tonight, Jon. What I need to tell you, it's not a wall conversation. It's not a thing that should be said in the wind at 700 feet. It needs..." Ned stopped. "It needs a room, and a fire, and more time than the cold is going to give us. You've been putting this off my whole life." The words hit like stones. "You have. Every time I asked about my mother, every time, from the time I was old enough to ask, you said, 'When you're older, when the time is right, when I come back.' You never came back. The time was never right. And now we're both at the wall, and the time is..." Jon's voice cracked. Not broke, cracked. The specific fracture of a controlled surface under stress, the sound that ice made before it gave way. The time is running out. Whatever is north of us, it's coming. You know it. I know it. Mormont knows it. And I'm asking you to tell me who I am before the thing that's coming arrives and makes the knowing irrelevant. Ned looked at the north. The darkness out there was not empty. He could feel it, the same way Mormont felt it, the same way the Watch felt it. The specific atmospheric wrongness of a cold that wasn't weather, but intention. "Tomorrow," Ned said. "I promise you. Tomorrow. You've promised before." "I know. This time the promise has nowhere left to go. I'm at the wall. You're at the wall. There's nowhere to postpone to." He looked at Jon. "Tomorrow, in my quarters, after the morning meal, I'll tell you everything." Jon looked at him for a long time. The wind cut between them. The stars. The wall stars. The northern stars that were brighter and more numerous than the stars anywhere else in the realm, because the wall was above the haze and the light and the specific atmospheric interference that civilization produced. The stars were watching the conversation with the specific indifference of objects that had been watching human conversations for millions of years and that had never found any of them interesting enough to comment on. "Tomorrow," Jon said. He went down the stairs. Ned stayed on the wall. He looked north. He thought, "Tomorrow I tell him. Tomorrow I tell him who his mother was, and who his father was, and what he is. And the telling is going to break something. Not in him, in me. Because the telling means the last secret is gone. The last piece of Lyanna's promise is fulfilled. 15 years of carrying, and the carrying ends tomorrow, and the end is going to feel like... I don't know what it's going to feel like. He thought, lighter. It's going to feel lighter. He thought, or heavier, because the carrying was at least mine. Once it's shared, it's Jon's too. And Jon's burden is already heavy enough. The wind blew. Ned went down. Robb's War, the South, 298, 299 AC. Robb read his father's letter in his command tent at Moat Cailin. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked at the table, the map, the markers, the specific strategic layout of a campaign that he had been building for weeks, and that the letter was not stopping but redirecting. He was 16. He was 16 years old, and he was leading 20,000 men, and his father's letter was telling him that the rescue mission was unnecessary, and that the Wall needed men, and that the North was facing something worse than Lannisters. Robb looked at Catelyn. Catelyn was in the tent, had been in the tent since the campaign started. The specific Catelyn role of advisor and manager, and the person who prevented Robb's charisma from overrunning his caution. She was reading her own copy of Ned's letter, a separate letter, private, that had arrived in the same raven bag, and that Catelyn had read with the specific composure of a woman receiving communication from a husband she would never see again, and who was managing the receiving through the discipline that had carried her through every crisis of her adult life. "He's alive," Catelyn said. "He's alive. At the Wall. At the Wall. With Jon." The mention of Jon produced the specific flicker in Catelyn's composure that Jon's mention always produced. The small, involuntary, immediately suppressed. Response to the name that represented the one thing about her marriage that Catelyn could not reconcile with her understanding of her husband. He wants men sent to the Wall. He says the Wall needs men, that the ranging reports are bad, bad. He says something is building in the north. Beyond the Wall. Robb held her gaze. The old stories. The old stories are old. I know. But Father doesn't say things he doesn't believe. Even when saying them costs him everything. That's his. That's who he is. Robb's voice caught on the present tense and corrected to the past tense. And then corrected back, because his father was alive and the present tense was correct. And the correcting was the specific linguistic confusion of a son adjusting to the fact that his father existed in a new category that the language hadn't caught up to. The girls, Catelyn said. The girls. This was the thing. The anchor, the variable that Ned's letter couldn't resolve and that Robb's campaign couldn't ignore. Sansa and Arya were in King's Landing. In Cersei's hands. The confession and the sentencing had been predicated on the assumption that the girls would be safe, that the taking of the Black was the price of their safety. But Cersei's word was, Robb had learned, through Catelyn, through the reports, through the specific education in Lannister trustworthiness that the last 6 months had provided, not reliable. Cersei's word was a tool. Cersei's word was deployed when deploying it served Cersei's interests, and retracted when the retracting served them better. "I'm going south," Robb said. "For the girls. Not for Father. Father is where Father is. For Sansa and Arya. And the Wall? I'll send men, not 20,000. I can't send 20,000 north when there's a war in the south. But 2,000. 3, the best. The men who can hold the Wall while I handle the Lannisters. Your father asked. My father asked me to make my own decisions. That's what he wrote. The decisions are yours." Robb held her gaze. "I'm making them." Catelyn looked at her son. She thought, 16. He's 16, and he's leading an army, and he's making decisions that will determine whether his sisters live or die, and whether the North survives, and whether the realm holds together or fractures into the specific catastrophic fragments that wars produced. She thought, he's good at this. better than Ned was. Not because he's smarter, because he's different. Because the Tully blood mixed with the Stark blood produced something that was both honorable and flexible, both principled and political, and the combination was the thing that the situation required. She thought, he's going to make mistakes. He's 16. The mistakes are coming. She said, then march. For the girls. And send the men north. And, Robb, what? Don't be your father. You said he told you that. Listen to it. Your father's mistakes were the mistakes of a man who put honor above strategy. Don't make those mistakes. What mistakes should I make instead? Different ones. Ones you can survive. Robb looked at the map, at the markers, at the specific geography of a war that was going to be fought on two fronts. The south against the Lannisters, the north against whatever was building beyond the wall. And that required a commander who could hold both fronts simultaneously. He was 16. He was terrified. He didn't show it. He marched. The truth, what Ned carried, 298 AC. He told Jon on a Thursday morning in his quarters, the fire burning, low, the specific watchfire that was never large enough to actually warm a room, but that provided the psychological comfort of flame, the human animal's oldest tool against the dark. The door was closed. Ghost was outside. Jon had left the wolf in the corridor, which was itself a decision, the specific choice of a man who wanted privacy for what was coming, and who understood that even a direwolf's presence was a presence too many. They sat across from each other. The table between them, small, scarred, the specific watch furniture that was built for function and that carried the accumulated damage of decades of use. 2 cups, untouched. The cups were a gesture. Jon had brought ale, the watch ale that tasted like it had been brewed by someone who had been told the concept of ale but had never personally experienced it. Neither of them was drinking because drinking required a casualness that the conversation didn't support. Ned said, "Your mother was Lyanna Stark." The room held. Jon's face went through something that Ned had been watching for, and that he would remember for the rest of his life. The specific progression of comprehension in a person, hearing information that rearranged everything. Not a single expression. A sequence. Confusion. Recalculation. The specific, deep brain processing of a mind encountering a new foundation and measuring it against the old one and finding the new one. Not better, not worse. Different. Different in a way that changed the shape of every room the mind had ever occupied. Lyanna. My sister. Jon stopped, started, stopped. The language was failing him, because the language had been built on assumptions, and the assumptions were gone. You're not my father. I raised you. I'm the man who held you, and fed you, and trained you, and loved you. I am your father, in every way that matters, except the one way that, Ned's voice tightened, except the biological way. And the biological way is Lyanna and Rhaegar Targaryen. The second piece, Jon's face, the second progression, not the same as the first, deeper, the specific seismic shift that happened when the ground beneath a person's identity moved, and the person was standing on the ground while it moved. Rhaegar Targaryen, the Crown Prince, the man who... The stories say he kidnapped Lyanna. The stories are... Ned stopped. He'd been thinking about this for 15 years, the specific phrasing, the way to deliver information that was both truth and context. The truth without the context being misleading, and the context without the truth being incomplete. The stories are wrong, or incomplete. Lyanna went with Rhaegar. I don't know the full truth of it, whether it was love or something else, whether she chose freely or was manipulated, whether the marriage was real or performed. I know they were together. I know you were the result. Jon couldn't finish the word. The word was Targaryen, and the word was too large for the room, and the room was too small for the word. You're Lyanna's son. That's what she wanted me to know. That's what she made me promise. At the Tower of Joy, when she was dying. When you were hours old in her arms and the blood was... Ned stopped. Not for drama. Because the memory was physical, and the physical overrode the verbal. She said, "Promise me, Ned." She said, "Keep him safe." She said, "Robert will kill him if he knows." Robert loved Lyanna. Or believed he did. The distinction, it doesn't matter. Robert would have killed Rhaegar's son, a Targaryen. Robert's hatred of Targaryens was constitutional. He would have killed you as an infant and called it justice, and believed the calling. Jon stood. He walked to the window, the view, the wall's inner face, ice and stone, the specific claustrophobic geography of Castle Black that was visible from every window in the castle. He put his hands on the sill. 15 years. 15 years. You lied to me for 15 years. I lied to everyone for 15 years. To you, to Cat, to Robert, to the realm. Because the alternative was your death. You let me believe I was a bastard. I let everyone believe you were my bastard because the believing kept you alive. Cat hated me. The words landed like a hammer. Catelyn didn't. She hated me. Not constantly, not violently, but the cold, the looking away, the specific distance that she maintained for 14 years because she believed I was the proof that you broke your vows. She hated what I represented, and the representing was a lie, and you let her carry it. For 15 years. Jon's voice was doing something that Jon's voice rarely did. Shaking, not loudly. The specific low-frequency tremor of a man managing an internal detonation through the mechanism of controlled speech. You let your wife hate a child for something the child didn't do, because the hating was safer than the knowing. That's what you did. I'm not asking. I'm telling you, because I need to say it out loud so you hear it the way I've been living it. Ned sat. The sitting was not a choice. The standing had become impossible under the weight of what Jon was saying, which was true, which was the cost of the lie, which was the thing Ned had known for 15 years was the cost, and that he had been willing to pay, because the alternative, Jon's death, was worse, but the willingness to pay hadn't reduced the cost. The cost was standing across the room with Lyanna's eyes and a tremor in his voice telling Ned what the cost felt like from the inside. You're right. Jon looked at him. You're right. About Cat. About the lie. About the cost. I chose to protect your life at the cost of what your life felt like. I made you a bastard to keep you alive, and the being a bastard was, I know what it was. I watched what it was for 14 years. I watched Cat's coldness, and I watched you absorb it, and I could have stopped it. Could have told her the truth. Could have given her the information that would have changed everything, and I didn't. Because every person who knew was a person who could break, and the breaking would kill you. You didn't trust her. I didn't trust anyone, not because they weren't trustworthy, because the secret was too dangerous. One mistake, one wrong word, one overheard conversation. And Robert sends men to Winterfell, and you die in your bed. I was safe. You were safe because nobody knew. The moment somebody knew, I was safe, and I was miserable. Those two things coexisted. The safety and the misery, and the choice between them was yours, not mine. Ned had nothing to say to this. The fire cracked. The sound was loud in the room because the room was full of silence that had edges. The specific dangerous quiet that happened between two people who loved each other and who had just discovered that the love had been shaped by a lie, and that the lie's removal was rearranging the love into something that might be larger or might be broken, and that wasn't going to be identifiable until the rearranging was complete. Jon sat down, not across from Ned, in the chair by the fire, the chair that was the room's one comfortable piece of furniture, the chair that had been worn into shape by decades of watch brothers who had sat in it after long shifts and who had left the specific physical impression of exhaustion in the cushion. I'm a Targaryen, by blood. What does that mean? It means, Ned looked at his hands. I don't know what it means. I've been carrying the fact for 15 years, and I've never let myself think about what the fact means, because thinking about it required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it required planning for it, and planning for it felt like tempting fate. If I planned for the day you learnt the truth, the day would come, and the day coming meant the secret was out, and the secret being out meant danger. You know what it means politically. Politically, Ned looked at him. Politically, it means you have a claim to the Iron Throne. A strong one. Rhaegar was the crown prince. You're his son. If the Targaryen line is restored, I don't want the throne. I know. I took the black. The watch. Whatever claim I had, if I had one, it's renounced. The watch renounces political claims, whether the realm agrees with the renunciation when the person renouncing has the strongest Targaryen claim. Since the dynasty fell, that's a different question. Jon looked at the fire. Why are you telling me now? Because you asked. Because you were right. The time was running out. And because, Ned leaned forward, because whatever is coming from the north, whatever the rangings are finding, whatever Mormont sees in the reports, the thing that's coming doesn't care about bloodlines or thrones, or the specific political architecture that the South is fighting about. The thing that's coming is going to require everything we have, and the everything includes knowing who you are. Because of the blood. Because of the blood, the Targaryen blood, the Stark blood. You have both, Jon. Your Maester Aemon is here, a Targaryen at the Wall. He's 100 years old. Talk to him about the blood, about what the blood does, about the prophecies that your father believed in prophecies. Rhaegar, he believed that the combination of Stark and Targaryen blood would produce something that the world needed. Prophecies? I know how I sound. I'm Ned Stark. I believe in what I can see and hold and swing. Prophecies are stories. But stories come from somewhere. And whatever is north of the Wall, the stories about it are 8,000 years old, and the something that created those stories is still there. Jon looked at him. The look lasted. The specific duration that happened when a person was processing not just information, but identity. The reassembly of self that occurred when the foundation of who you believed yourself to be was replaced by a different foundation, and the self had to be rebuilt on the new one. I need to think. Take the time you need. I need to think, and I need to not. I need you to not be in the room while I think. Because looking at you while I think about this is... Jon stopped. You're still the man who raised me. That doesn't go away. But the raising was inside a lie, and the lie just came out. And I need to figure out what's left when the lie is subtracted. I understand. Do you? No. Probably not. I understand the idea of it. The feeling of it is yours. Jon stood, went to the door, opened it. Ghost was in the corridor. White fur, red eyes. The specific, patient presence of an animal that had been waiting without complaint, because waiting was what Ghost did. Jon, he turned. Your mother was the bravest person I've ever known. Jon looked at him, at the man who had raised him, at the man who had lied to him, at the man who had loved him and deceived him and protected him and hurt him through the specific mechanism of protection that required hurt as its price. I know, Jon said. She'd have to be. To produce this. He left. Ned sat in the room. The fire was dying. He didn't add wood. He He sat in the cooling room and felt the specific lightness that he had expected. The burden lifted, the secret shared, the 15-year weight redistributed, and underneath the lightness, the heaviness, the cost, the expression on Jon's face when the truth arrived, the specific knowledge that the truth had been both necessary and damaging, and that the necessity did not reduce the damage. He sat until the fire was embers. Then he got up and went to his duties. The watch didn't stop for personal crises. The wall didn't stop for anything. Jon and Aemon, 298 AC. Jon went to Maester Aemon the same day, not because Ned had told him to, because the information was too large for one room and one conversation, and the largeness needed another perspective, and Aemon was the only other person at the wall who shared Jon's blood and who could speak about the blood from inside it. Aemon's cell was warm and dark. The old man was in his chair, the specific chair that had been molded to Aemon's body over decades and that held him now the way a nest held an egg, completely, with the awareness that the thing being held was both durable and fragile. "You know," Jon said. "Know what?" "About me. About Rhaegar. My mother." Aemon was still. The specific stillness of a very old man hearing something he may or may not have been waiting to hear. "I suspected, when you arrived. The name, Snow, Stark, the colouring. The age was right. The timing." The old man's blind eyes pointed in Jon's direction. "Rhaegar was my great-great-nephew. My brother was Aegon V, his son Jaehaerys, his son Aerys, his son Rhaegar. That makes you my. The relationship is distant enough that the arithmetic is academic. The point is, you're family. I don't feel like family. That's because family is a feeling, and feelings require proximity, and we've had none." Aemon's voice was the voice of a man who had spent 100 years thinking about family from the distance that the wall imposed. "Sit. Tell me what Ned told you." Jon told him. Everything. Lyanna, Rhaegar, the Tower of Joy, the promise, the lie. Aemon listened. When Jon finished, Aemon was quiet for a long time. "Rhaegar believed in the prophecy," Aemon said. "The prince who was promised. The song of ice and fire. He believed," the old man's voice was careful, "the specific care of someone handling material that was both precious and explosive. He believed the prince would be born of his line. He was, not wrong. Perhaps the prophecy is ambiguous. Prophecy is always ambiguous. The value of prophecy is not in its specificity but in its direction. It points. It doesn't map. I don't believe in prophecy." "Good. Neither did your mother, from what I understand. The Starks are practical people. The Targaryens are visionary people. The combination is supposed to produce someone who can see the vision and do the work." Aemon's mouth twitched. "Can you see the vision?" "I can see the wall. I can see what's coming. Not through prophecy, through the ranging reports and the cold and the specific feeling that something wrong is happening in the north. That's the vision. Not mystical, practical, the vision of a person standing in the right place looking in the right direction. And the work? The work is keeping the wall. The work is preparing the watch. The work is doing the specific daily unglamorous thing that keeps the darkness on the other side of the ice." Aemon leaned forward. "The prophecy says a prince saves the world. Maybe, or maybe a person does. A person who was born with the right blood, and who was raised with the right values, and who ended up in the right place. Not because destiny put them there, because choices put them there, their choices and others. Ned's choice. Ned's choice to protect you. Lyanna's choice to love Rhaegar. Your choice to take the black. The choices produced. You. Here, on the wall. When the wall needs someone who can be both things, the Stark endurance and the Targaryen fire, the ice and the fire." Jon was quiet. "I'm a steward's bastard who just found out he's a prince who doesn't exist. legally because his parents were on opposite sides of a war, and his father died on a river and his mother died in a tower, and the man who raised him lied to everyone for 15 years and is now sleeping. 3. Doors down from him in an institution that requires him to renounce everything his blood supposedly entitles him to. Aemon smiled. The smile of 100 years. Welcome to being a Targaryen. It's always been complicated. Jon almost laughed. Almost the blood, Jon said. What does it do? The Targaryen blood. Specifically, it makes you difficult. Brilliant, prone to obsession. Resistant to fire, in some lines. Connected to dragons, in the old days. In the current day, Aemon paused. In the current day, the blood connects you to things that other blood doesn't connect to. The fire, the old magic, the things that live in the world underneath the world that the maesters say doesn't exist, and that the wall was built using. And the Stark blood? The Stark blood connects you to the old gods. The weirwoods, the ice, the specific northern magic that is different from the Targaryen fire magic, but that is complementary. The two bloods together are. Aemon was choosing his words with the specific care of a man who had been thinking about this for decades. The two bloods together are what the wall needs, because the wall was built with both. The wall is ice and fire. The wall is Stark and Targaryen. The wall is the thing that your blood, your specific blood, the combination, was made to maintain. Jon sat with this. He sat with it the way Ned sat with things thoroughly, methodically, with the specific Stark approach to processing that was not fast, but was comprehensive. The processing took time. The time was hours. He sat in Aemon's cell, and they talked, and the talking was the first conversation Jon had ever had about who he was that was based on truth rather than on the fiction that had been constructed to protect him. He left Aemon's cell as the sun was setting, the wall's sunset, which was the most spectacular sunset in the world because the ice caught the light and refracted it into the specific prismatic display that made the wall look, for 20 minutes every evening, like it was on fire. He stood in the yard. He looked at the wall. He thought, I am Stark and Targaryen. I am ice and fire. I am the thing that the wall was built with, and the thing that the wall was built for. Not because of prophecy, because of blood. Because the blood is a fact, and the fact is here. And I'm here, and whatever is coming, and the fact and the coming are going to meet. He thought, I need to talk to Ned. He thought, not father. Ned. Because the word has changed. The word means something different now, and the different meaning needs a different word, and the different word is uncle. The man who raised me. The man who lied. The man who loved me enough to lie, and whose lying damaged me, and whose damage kept me alive. He went to find Ned. He found him in the common hall. At dinner, eating the watch food, the black bread, the thin stew, the specific institutional cuisine that was designed to keep men alive rather than to make them happy, and that accomplished the first goal while aggressively failing at the second. Jon sat across from him. I talked to Aemon. I know. He sent word. He says, the blood matters. The combination. Stark and Targaryen. I know what the combination is supposed to mean. It means the wall needs me. Jon held his gaze. Not as a prophecy, not as a prince who was promised, as a person with the right blood standing in the right place when the right place needs the right blood. Ned looked at him. I forgive you, Jon said. The words hit Ned harder than anything Jon had said that morning. Harder than the accusations, harder than the anger. The forgiveness was worse than the fury, because the fury was a reaction and the forgiveness was a decision, and the decision came from the specific deep place where Jon made his real decisions, not the surface, not the performance, the underneath, the place where Jon was Jon. I forgive you for the lie. Not because the lie was right, because the lie was necessary. And the necessity doesn't make it right, but the necessity makes it. Survivable. I survived. I'm here. The lie put me here, and here is where I need to be. He held the gaze. I'm angry. The anger isn't going away. But the anger and the forgiveness can coexist. Because the anger is about the past, and the forgiveness is about the future, and the future is the wall, the threat, the work. Ned's eyes were red. He didn't speak. Not because he didn't have words, because the words were underneath the tears and the tears were winning. Eat your stew, Jon said. It's terrible, but it's what we have. Ned ate his stew. Jon ate his stew. They sat in the common hall at Castle Black with terrible food and a new understanding, and the specific tentative architecture of a relationship being. Rebuilt on different foundations, and the rebuilding was not complete, and was not going to be complete for a long time, but the rebuilding was started, and the starting was enough. Ask Sam what the fat boy saw. 298 AC. Samwell Tarly watched the Stark situation the way he watched everything at Castle Black, from the periphery, with the comprehensive observational attention of a boy who had been marginal his entire life, and who had developed, through the marginality, the ability to see things that people at the center missed. He saw Jon change. Not dramatically. The change was internal. The rearrangement of identity that the truth about Jon's parentage had produced. But Sam had been Jon's closest friend at the Wall for months, and the closeness gave Sam access to the specific micro-expressions and behavioral shifts that told him something enormous had happened even before Jon told him what. Jon told him. On a night patrol, the two of them on the wall's top, walking the perimeter, the stars above and the darkness below, and the specific privacy that altitude provided. I'm Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Sam stopped walking. My mother was Lyanna Stark. Ned's sister. He's my uncle. Not my father. My uncle. He lied to everyone for 15 years to keep me alive because Robert would have killed a Targaryen baby. Sam looked at Jon. At the face he'd been looking at for months. The dark hair, the grey eyes, the face that was Stark in every visible line, and that was apparently also Targaryen in the lines that weren't visible. That's... Sam searched for the word. Sam's vocabulary was extensive, the product of a childhood spent reading while other boys trained, and the extensiveness was failing him because the situation exceeded the vocabulary. That's enormous. That's one word for it. You're, Jon, you're technically the Targaryen succession. I took the black. Whatever claim the blood gives me, the oath takes away. Legally, the oath takes it away. Politically, I'm not interested in politically. You should be, because other people are going to be interested in it for you. Sam looked at him with the specific assessment of a boy who was afraid of most things, but who was not afraid of ideas, and who understood, because reading had taught him, that ideas were more dangerous than swords, because swords could only kill you once, and ideas could kill you repeatedly. When people learn this, and they will learn this, secrets come out. They always come out. When people learn that Jon Snow is actually... What is your name? Your real name? My name is Jon. Your Rhaegar would have named you something. My name is Jon. The repetition was firm, the specific Jon firmness that closed conversations. Ned gave me the name. The name stays. Sam accepted this. Sam accepted most things that Jon was firm about, because the firmness was usually correct, and because arguing with Jon when Jon was firm was like arguing with the wall. You could make your case, and the wall would not move. Aemon knows. Aemon is family, in the specific distant Targaryen way. He's been helpful about the blood, about what it means. What does it mean? According to Aemon, it means I'm a category that doesn't have a precedent. Stark and Targaryen, ice and fire. The combination is supposed to be, Jon looked north, relevant to what's out there. The army, the cold, the thing the wall was built for. Jon looked at Sam. I don't believe in prophecy, Sam. I believe in the ranging reports and the cold and the dead that the Rangers have seen. But the blood, Aemon says the blood matters, that the combination of Stark and Targaryen isn't just genealogical, it's functional. The blood does things. What things? I don't know yet. But the wolf, ghost, the connection is, since I learned the truth, since Ned told me, the connection with ghost has been different, stronger. Not just the warging, which I've been doing since before I knew what warging was. Something else. A deepening. Sam filed this. In the Sam category of information that is important and that I don't understand yet, and that I'm going to think about until I do. The category was Sam's primary cognitive tool, the filing, the cross-referencing, the specific scholarly approach to experience that had made Sam useless as a warrior and invaluable as an analyst. What about Ned? How are you? We're building something. Anew, I don't have the word. Relationship isn't right, because relationship implies a category and the category doesn't exist, where we sit at the same table, we eat the same food, we talk about the same problems, and underneath the sitting and the eating and the talking is the 15 years of lie and the truth that came after, and the specific ongoing renegotiation of what we are to each other. That sounds exhausting. It is exhausting. It's also the only honest thing I've ever had. The bastard thing was a lie. The Stark thing was a lie. The Jon Snow identity that I built my entire life around was a construction. What I have now, the uncle, the watch, the wall, it's real. It's built on truth instead of fiction. And the real, even when the real is exhausting and confusing and, he gestured vaguely at the darkness, the real is better. Sam looked at his friend. He thought, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, the Lord Commander's ranger, Rhaegar's son, Lyanna's boy, the bastard who wasn't a bastard. He thought, whatever the blood does, whatever the prophecy says, whatever comes out of the dark, this man is going to face it. Not because of destiny, because of the specific quality that Jon has always had, and that the truth hasn't changed, and that the lie didn't produce, the quality of being the man who stands when others sit. He thought, I'm glad I'm his friend. He said, the stew tonight is especially bad. It's always especially bad. This is a new especially. That's what Ned said. They walked the wall. The stars watched. Ghost padded alongside them, white in the starlight, the red eyes catching the reflected light of 1,000,000 distant suns. Catelyn, the second truth. 289. AC. The letter came from Ned. Not the official letters, not the reports from the wall, the military correspondence that Robb received and that Catelyn read as Robb's advisor. A private letter. Sealed with Ned's seal, the seal he still used, the direwolf, because the watch hadn't given him a new seal and Ned had not yet surrendered the old one. The letter said, Cat. There is something I should have told you 15 years ago. I am telling you now because the secret has been shared with Jon, and the sharing means it will not stay a secret, and because you deserve to hear it from me rather than through the specific channels of rumor that carry information faster and less accurately than I can. Jon is not my son. Jon is my nephew. His mother was Lyanna. His father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Lyanna made me promise. At the Tower of Joy. She was dying, and she made me promise to protect her son, and the protection required the lie. I claimed Jon as my bastard, because the claiming was the disguise, and the disguise was the only thing between Jon and Robert's hammer. I lied to you. For 15 years, I let you believe that I had broken my vows, and that Jon was the proof, and I watched the believing cause you pain, and I could have stopped it, and I didn't, because every person who knew was a person who could break under pressure, and the breaking would have killed Jon. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am providing information. What you do with the information, the anger, the grief, the reassessment, is yours. I have no right to ask for anything regarding this. I have only the obligation to tell the truth, and the truth is told, and the obligation is discharged. I'm sorry. Ned. Catelyn read the letter in her chambers at Winterfell. She read it 3 times. She set it down. She picked it up. She set it down again. The specific physical restlessness of a woman whose body needed to do something while her mind processed something enormous. The information was too large for sitting and not appropriate for pacing, and the result was the specific fidgeting that Catelyn never did in public, and that was, in private, the physical expression of a Tully in crisis. Lyanna. Not a woman in the South. Not a camp follower. Not the nameless, faceless betrayal that Catelyn had constructed in her mind over 14 years, and that had been the foundation of the specific cold architecture she'd built around Jon. Lyanna. Ned's sister. The girl who died in the rebellion. The ghost who haunted Robert's marriage, and who had, apparently, haunted Catelyn's too. She thought about Jon. She thought about him with the specific, raw, unfiltered honesty that private moments allowed, and that public moments didn't. She thought about the boy she had been cold to for 14 years. The boy who sat at the side table because she had arranged the side table. The boy whose existence she had treated as an insult when the existence was a rescue, a promise kept, a child saved from murder by a man who loved his sister enough to lie to everyone he loved. The anger came, not at Ned, at herself. The specific, self-directed fury of a woman discovering that she had been cruel to a child for 14 years based on a fiction, and that the cruelty was her response to the fiction, and the fiction was constructed by the person she trusted most, and the trust didn't excuse the cruelty, because the cruelty had been her choice. She could have been kind to Jon. She could have looked at a motherless boy in her household and chosen warmth instead of cold. The lie provided the reason for the cold, but the cold was her decision, and the decision was hers to carry. Then the anger redirected at Ned for the lie, for the 15 years of carrying a fiction that damaged her and Jon and the family, for the specific Ned Stark approach to problems that said, I will carry this alone, because carrying alone is noble, and the nobility of the carrying was real, and the damage of the carrying was also real, and the two coexisted. Then the anger settled into something that was not anger, and not forgiveness, and not understanding, but was acknowledgement. The specific Catelyn acknowledgement that happened when the emotional processing was complete, and the pragmatic assessment began. Ned had lied. The lie had protected a child. The lie had damaged a family. Both were true. Both would remain true. The anger would remain. The love would remain. The coexistence was the marriage, the specific architecture of a relationship built on truth and lie simultaneously, and now, with the lie exposed, being rebuilt on truth alone. She wrote back. The letter was short. Catelyn was a woman who used many words when the situation required them, and few when the situation didn't. And this situation required few, because the few were the right ones. Ned. I received your letter. I understand the reasons. I don't forgive them yet. The yet is important. It means the forgiveness is in process, not absent. Jon should know that the coldness was mine, and that the coldness was wrong, and that the wrongness is mine to carry. Come home when you can. Cat. She sealed the letter. She sent it north. Then she went to the Godswood, not because she worshipped the old gods, because the Godswood was where Ned went when the weight was too heavy for indoor rooms, and Catelyn wanted to understand what the weight felt like from the place where Ned carried it. She sat beside the heart tree. She didn't pray. She sat. The tree watched. The tree had been watching Starks sit with their weight for 8,000 years. One more was not going to tire it. The Ranging, 299 AC. The Great Ranging was Mormont's idea. 300 men, a third of the Watch's total strength, the specific, calculated risk of sending a significant force beyond the wall to determine, once and for all, what was building in the north. The intelligence was fragmentary, and the fragments were terrifying, and the terrifying required confirmation, because Mormont couldn't request men and resources from the realm without the specific evidence that confirmation would provide. "I need eyes out there," Mormont said in the command meeting. "Not rangers in pairs who don't come back. A force, large enough to survive contact, large enough to see what's happening and report." Jon volunteered. This was expected. Jon was a ranger. Jon was competent. Jon was the specific kind of watch brother who volunteered for dangerous missions because the volunteering was what the watch required, and because Jon's response to fear was to walk toward the thing he was afraid of rather than away from it. Ned volunteered. This was not expected. "You're a steward," Jon said. In the corridor after the meeting, the specific, quiet confrontation of a conversation that should have been louder, and that was being held at reduced volume because the corridor was not private, and the conversation was, "I'm a soldier who's been assigned to steward duties. The assignment doesn't change the competence. You've been at the wall for 3 months. The ranging is the most important thing the watch is doing, and I'm not staying behind while you go beyond the wall." Ned caught himself, the "my son" that he'd been about to say, and that he'd redirected, because the word "son" was complicated now, and the complication required navigation that this corridor didn't provide. Mormont approved it? Mormont approved it because Mormont wants someone on the ranging who can write the report that convinces the lords. The Rangers can fight. The Rangers can't write a letter that makes Tywin Lannister send men to the wall. Ned held Jon's gaze. "I can." Jon looked at him. The looking was the new looking, the post-truth looking, the specific Jon assessment that was simultaneously the old affection, the son for the father looking that Jon had done his entire life, and the new recalibration, the nephew for the uncle looking that was still forming. The combination produced a gaze that was both warm and evaluative, both loving and wary. "Stay close to me." "I will. I mean it. Beyond the wall is not. This isn't Winterfell or King's Landing. This isn't politics. This is the kind of place where a man wanders 20 feet from camp and the cold takes him and nobody finds the body. I've been in combat, Jon, not this kind of combat." The ranging departed on a morning in late winter, 300 men on horseback, carrying provisions for a month, armed with steel and the limited supply of dragonglass that Ned's letters had begun to produce from the south. The dragonglass came from Dragonstone. Stannis had authorized the mining and shipped the obsidian north at Ned's request. The specific Stannis efficiency of a man who did things correctly even when the things were unpopular, producing results faster than anyone expected. They went north. The wall's gate, the tunnel through the ice, the ancient passage that connected the south side to the north, the specific dark, narrow cold of a space carved through 700 feet of frozen water. The horses didn't like the tunnel. The men didn't like it either. The tunnel was the wall's throat, and passing through it felt like being swallowed. They emerged on the north side, and the world changed. Not gradually, immediately, the south side of the wall was cold. The north side was something else. The cold was different. Ned felt it, and the feeling was not meteorological but atmospheric. The specific quality of a place where the temperature was being produced by something other than weather. The haunted forest was old and dark and silent. Not the silence of empty places, the silence of full places where the things that filled them were not making noise. The trees were ancient, the undergrowth thick, the specific claustrophobic density of a forest that had been growing undisturbed for thousands of years and that had produced, through the undisturbed growing, a canopy so thick that daylight reached the forest floor in coins rather than sheets. They marched for 4 days. On the fourth day, they found the wildlings, not a war party, a migration. Thousands of them, moving south. The specific, desperate movement of people fleeing something. The entire population of a region in motion with their children and their animals and their possessions carried on their backs and in carts that were barely functional and that were being dragged through terrain that carts were not designed for. Mormont halted the column. They're running. Ned looked at the wildlings, at the faces, not the fierce warrior faces that the stories described, the savage northerners who raided the realm and who the wall was built to exclude. Afraid faces. The faces of parents with children who were cold and hungry and who were moving south, not because the south was attractive, but because the north was no longer survivable. From what? Ask them. The asking produced Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, a former watch brother who had deserted and who had, over years, united the wildling clans into a single force, not for conquest, but for survival. Mance was, Ned assessed him the way he assessed everyone, intelligent. Not the book intelligence of Meisters or the political intelligence of Southerners. The intelligence of a man who had been managing 100,000 people in a hostile environment and who had developed, through the managing, the specific practical wisdom that came from leading people who would kill you if you led them wrong. The dead are behind us, Mance said, not in the coded language of diplomacy, in the flat declarative of a man who didn't have time for diplomacy. 100,000 dead, maybe more, moving south, organized, led by things, cold things, not alive, not dead. Something else, the others. Call them what you want. They raise the dead. Every person who dies north of the wall joins their army. Every animal, every corpse that hasn't been burned. Mance looked at Mormont, looked at Ned. The assessment was rapid, and the assessment was, are these men going to help, or are these men going to fight? We're coming south, through the wall or over it. Your choice. But we're coming because the alternative is dying up here, and the dying adds to their numbers, and the numbers are already. Come through the gate, Ned said. Everyone looked at him. Come through the gate. Bring your people south. Every person south of the wall is a person who can't be raised against it. He looked at Mormont. The Watch exists to guard the realms of men. The wildlings are men. They're wildlings. They're people running from the dead. The distinction between wildling and southerner is a political distinction. The dead don't care about political distinctions. The dead will kill a wildling and a lord with the same indifference. Every person who dies north of the wall becomes a weapon pointed at the wall. Every person who comes south of the wall becomes a defender. Mormont looked at him. The Mormont assessment, the specific Lord Commander evaluation that processed information through 40 years of watch command and that produced decisions not on the basis of tradition, but on the basis of survival. Open the gate, Mormont said. The gate opened. 100,000 wildlings came south. Not smoothly. The logistics of moving 100,000 people through a gate designed for 100 were catastrophic. The specific administrative nightmare that Ned recognized from 15 years of managing northern populations, and that he stepped into with the competence of a man who had been doing this work his entire life, and who was, despite everything the Watch had stripped from him, still the best population manager available. He organized the passage. 3 days. Shifts. The women and children first, then the elderly, then the fighters. The passage was not orderly. Wildlings did not do orderly. Wildlings did the specific, chaotic, individual survival approach that free people used when institutions tried to organize them. But the passage happened, and the people came south, and the gate closed behind them. 100,000 people who could not be raised by the Night King. Ned looked at the wall. He thought, I just changed the math. 100,000 people south of the wall is 100,000 fewer weapons for the enemy. He thought, I also just created a refugee crisis that the Watch is not equipped to handle, and that the North is going to have to absorb, and that the South is going to object to. He thought, every solution creates a new problem. That's the nature of solutions. The new problem was, the dead were 4 days north. The dead were moving south. And the wall, 700 feet of ice, the greatest structure ever built, the 8,000-year bulwark against the cold, the wall was about to be tested. The preparation, 299 AC. Ned wrote the letter, not the letter to Robb. Robb's letter had already gone weeks ago, and Robb's response was the 3,000 men who were marching north and the dragon glass shipments that were arriving in carts from White Harbor. This letter was different. This letter was the letter to the realm. He wrote it at Mormont's desk, with Mormont's authority behind it and Mormont's Raven fleet to carry it. The letter was addressed to every Lord Paramount in the Seven Kingdoms, the Starks, the Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Arryns, the Baratheons, Stannis, who held Dragonstone, the Martells, the Tullys, the Greyjoys Bolon. The letter said, to the lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms, I write from Castle Black as a brother of the Night's Watch. I was once Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King. Those titles are gone. What remains is the authority of a man who has stood on the wall and looked north and seen what is coming. The army of the dead is real. It is not a story. It is not a myth. It is not the superstition of northerners who have spent too long in the cold. I have seen the wildlings who flee before it, 100,000 people who have come south through the wall because the alternative was joining the army that pursues them. I have spoken to their leaders. I have seen the fear. The army numbers in the hundreds of thousands. It grows with every death. Every person, every animal, every corpse that is not burned becomes a weapon in the enemy's ranks. The army is commanded by an intelligence that is not human and that does not negotiate and that wants one thing, to come south. The wall holds. For now. The wall needs men. The wall needs dragonglass, the obsidian that kills the dead. The wall needs the attention of a realm that has been fighting amongst itself while the real enemy has been building its force beyond the ice. I am not asking you to believe me because of who I was. I am asking you to believe the evidence. Send a representative to the wall. See for yourself. Stand on top and look north and tell me I'm wrong. The Night's Watch has 800 men. We need 10,000. The math is not complicated. The alternative to sending men is, when the wall falls, the army comes south, and every person it kills becomes a soldier in the army that killed them. Winter is coming. Eddard Stark, brother of the Night's Watch. He sent the ravens. The response was mixed. The realm was at war. Robb in the Riverlands, the Lannisters in the Westerlands, the Tyrells calculating, the Greyjoys raiding. The specific political environment of a kingdom at civil war was not the environment that produced rapid responses to requests from the wall, because the wall was far and the war was close, and humans were wired to respond to close threats faster than distant ones. But some responses came. Stannis sent men, 2,000, from Dragonstone with ships loaded with dragonglass, the obsidian deposits that Dragonstone sat on, and that Stannis had been mining, because Stannis' correspondence with Ned had included the information about dragonglass, and because Stannis' response to information was. Action, and Stannis' action was efficient, and the efficiency produced results faster than anyone expected. Robb's men arrived, the 3,000 northerners, marching north instead of south, carrying weapons and provisions, and the specific energy of men who were going to fight something that most of them didn't believe in yet, but that their lord had told them to fight, and that their lord's father had told their lord to fight, and that chain of command was enough. The Tyrells sent grain, not men, grain, the specific Tyrell contribution that was both generous and calculated. the offering of resources that didn't cost lives, the investment in the wall's survival that could be claimed as support without the risk that military support carried. Tywin sent nothing. This was expected. Tywin Lannister's response to a letter from the Wall was the Tywin response to everything that didn't directly affect the Lannister position, assessment, deferral, the specific strategic patience of a man who did not commit resources to problems that might resolve themselves. The Watch grew. From 800 to 5,000. Not enough. Not the 10,000 that Ned's letter had requested, but enough that the Wall's castles could be manned and the Wall's defense could be organized, and the specific skeleton crew approach that had been the Watch's operational reality for decades was replaced by something closer to functional. Ned organized. This was his role, not the fighting, not the ranging, not the specific dangerous work of the Wall's military operations. The organizing, the supply chain, the logistics of turning 5,000 men and 100,000 refugees into a functioning defense. Mormont had recognized the skill, and Mormont was using the skill the way you used any tool, completely, without sentiment. With a specific military pragmatism that said, the best tool for the job is the best tool for the job, regardless of how the tool arrived. Jon ranged. Jon was on the wall and beyond the wall, and in the specific dangerous middle distance between the Watch's safe territory and the enemy's advancing front. The Rangers brought back intelligence, the army's speed, the army's direction. The specific tactical information that the defense required and that could only be obtained by men who were willing to ride into the danger and ride back, and who survived the riding at a rate that was declining as the army grew closer. The dead were coming, not fast, not the dramatic charge of a military force rushing toward its objective, slow, the specific patient advance of something that didn't need to hurry because it had all the time in the world, and because the advance was not propelled by will, but by accumulation. Every creature that died in the path of the advance joined the advance. The advance grew as it moved. The growing was the speed. Ned stood on the wall and looked north. The cold was visible now, not as weather, as a phenomenon. The specific dark line on the northern horizon that was not cloud and not shadow, and not any natural atmospheric condition that Ned had seen in 40 years of living in the north. The dark line was the army's front. The cold that preceded the dead the way scouts preceded an army, the specific harbinger that told the Wall, this is coming. Prepare. Ned prepared. He prepared the way he prepared everything, methodically, comprehensively, with the specific attention to detail that had made him a good lord and a good hand, and that was now, at the Wall, being applied to the most important preparation of his life. The dragonglass was distributed. Every soldier, watch brother, northern volunteer, wildling fighter, received obsidian weapons. Blades, arrowheads, spear points, the specific black glass that killed the dead permanently, and that was the only material advantage the living had. The Wall's defenses were repaired. The stairs, the catapults, the fire trenches, the specific engineering of a fortification that had been deteriorating for centuries, and, that was now, in the weeks before the test, being brought back to something approaching operational capacity through the concentrated effort of 5,000. Men working in shifts. The wildlings were integrated. Not smoothly. The Watch's history with the wildlings was centuries of conflict, and the conflict didn't dissolve because a common enemy had appeared. But the integration happened because Ned insisted, and because Mormont supported, and because the math was undeniable. Every fighter on the right side of the Wall was a fighter the Wall needed. Jon commanded the ranging parties, the intelligence-gathering operations that tracked the army's advance, and that provided the command with the specific real-time information that defensive planning required. Jon was good at this. Good at the specific combination of courage and caution that ranging required, the going out and coming back that was the ranger's art, and that Jon performed with the natural competence of a man who had been training for this his whole life without knowing what he was training for. Ned watched Jon work. He watched from the Wall, from the command quarters, from the specific administrative positions that his role occupied. He watched Jon, and he saw, for the first time, with the specific clarity that the truth provided, what Jon was. Not a bastard, not a recruit, not a steward or a ranger or a watch brother. A commander, the Targaryen fire, the specific aggressive intelligence that Jon brought to tactical decisions, the speed and the creativity and the willingness to take risks that the situation required. The stark ice, the endurance, the discipline, the specific refusal to break under pressure that the North bred into its people over 8,000 years. Both in one person. On the wall, Ned thought Lyanna would be proud. He thought Rhaegar would be fascinated. Rhaegar would see the prophecy fulfilling itself. Rhaegar would look at Jon and see destiny. He thought, I look at Jon and I see a person who is good at the thing the situation requires. Not because of destiny, because of training and temperament and the specific combination of genetics and environment that produced him. He thought, maybe the prophecy and the person are the same thing. Maybe the prophecy is just a word for someone who was built for this. The dark line on the horizon grew closer. The wall waited. The Battle of the Wall. 299 Nakart. They came on a night when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The cold arrived first, the specific, unnatural cold that preceded the army, the atmospheric warning that the wall had been feeling for weeks, and that now, in the specific compression of 1 hour, became absolute. The fires on the wall flickered. The torches dimmed. The specific thermal signature of something inhuman pressing against the boundary that the wall represented. Then the sound. Not a sound that Ned had a reference for. Not the sound of an army. Not the marching and the shouting and the specific acoustic chaos of living men moving toward a fight. This sound was quieter and worse. The sound of 100,000 things that were not alive moving through the forest. The cracking of branches under feet that didn't feel the cracking. The rustle of bodies that didn't breathe pressing through undergrowth that didn't slow them. Ned was on the wall. At the top. With Mormont. With Jon. With the commanders, the specific ad hoc command structure that the preparation had built. The watch officers and the northern lords and the wildling leaders standing shoulder to shoulder on a wall that most of them would have been fighting each other on a month ago, and that they were now defending together because the alternative was all of them dead. The first wave was visible in the starlight. Not faces, shapes. The specific mass darkness of bodies moving through the tree line, emerging from the haunted forest into the cleared ground before the wall. Hundreds. Thousands. Tens of thousands. The shapes kept coming, and the coming didn't stop, and the not stopping was the specific horror of an enemy that didn't have a rear guard because the entire army was front. Archers, Jon said. The order carried down the wall. The archers, watch brothers, northerners, wildling bowmen, knocked, drew. The arrows were dragon glass tipped, the specific adaptation that the preparation had produced, obsidian arrowheads that would kill the dead on impact. Loose. The first volley went into the dark. The sound of 1,000 arrows hitting 100,000 bodies was, Ned would describe it later, in the letter that he wrote to Robb, in the specific, flat language of military report that was the only register available for describing something that exceeded the vocabulary, like hail on a tin roof. The specific staccato impact of projectiles hitting targets. Some of the targets fell, most didn't. The arrows hit, and the dead absorbed the arrows and kept moving because the arrows that hit non-vital spots didn't kill, and the dead didn't stop for non-lethal damage. The dragonglass arrows, the ones that hit, killed. Permanently. The dead that took obsidian fell and did not rise. The bodies collapsed with the specific finality of things whose animation had been severed at the source. Not enough. 1,000 arrows killed 100 dead. 100,000 dead remained. The math was Ned could see the math the way he saw all logistical problems. The ratio of ammunition to enemy, the rate of fire against the rate of advance. The math was against them. "Fire trenches," Mormont ordered. The trenches ignited. The fire line that had been dug into the frozen ground before the wall, filled with pitch and oil and the specific incendiary material that burned hot enough to stop an advance. The fire caught. The dark retreated briefly. The specific momentary hesitation of things that were controlled by an intelligence that understood fire and that was calculating the fire's duration. The fire burned for 2 hours. During those 2 hours, the wall's defenders killed. The archers loosed until the quivers were empty. The catapults threw burning pitch into the mass beyond the trenches. The specific defensive advantage of 700 feet of ice, the height, the impossibility of climbing, the absolute physical barrier, held. The fire burned down. The dead came again. "They're going to test the gate," Jon said. He was beside Ned on the wall, watching the advance with the specific tactical assessment that Jon brought to combat, the fast reading of the situation, the identification of the enemy's intention, the creative response that the situation required. The wall holds against climbing. The gate doesn't hold against sustained pressure. How much pressure? 100,000 bodies pressing against a gate that was designed for— Jon looked at the gate, 300 feet below them. The gate was designed for wildling raids. Hundreds, not hundreds of thousands. Ned looked at the gate. He looked at the army. He looked at the specific tactical problem that the situation presented. A barrier that was unbreachable on top and vulnerable at the bottom. An enemy that couldn't climb and that could press. And the pressing was going to destroy the gate the way water destroyed dams, not through force, but through accumulation. "Collapse the tunnel." Jon looked at him. "Bring down the tunnel. The passage through the wall. Fill it with ice and stone and make the gate, not a gate. Make it wall." Ned held Jon's gaze. The wall was built without a gate. The gates were added later, for the Watcher's convenience. Remove the convenience. Close the wall. That traps us. No more rangings. No communication with the north side. The north side is dead. Everything north of the wall is dead or dying. The rangings are over. The intelligence is complete. We know what's out there. Close the wall. Jon looked at Mormont. Mormont looked at Ned. The assessment was fast. Mormont was a military commander, and military commanders made decisions at the speed of combat. The decision was, Ned was right. The gate was the vulnerability. The vulnerability could be eliminated by eliminating the gate. The elimination was permanent, and the permanence was the price. "Do it," Mormont said. Jon organized the collapse. The builders, the Watch's engineers, the men who maintained the wall's structure, placed the charges. Not explosive charges, ice charges. The specific engineering of a controlled collapse that used the wall's own weight to fill the tunnel. The 700 feet of ice above the passage pressing down into the space that the passage occupied and filling it with the specific permanent solidity of compressed frozen water. The tunnel came down. The sound was enormous. The specific deep frequency rumble of hundreds of thousands of tons of ice settling into a new configuration. The wall's structure absorbing the collapse and redistributing the weight and producing a surface that was, where the gate had been, seamless. Ice on ice. Wall on wall. The gate was gone. The dead pressed against solid ice. They pressed for 3 days. 3 days of 100,000 dead, pushing against a wall that was 700 feet tall and hundreds of feet thick at the base, and that had been standing for 8,000 years, and that was not going to be moved by pushing. The dead pressed, and the wall held, and the pressing was the specific futile effort of a force that was irresistible meeting an object that was immovable, and the collision producing not movement, but stalemate. On the 3rd day, the cold retreated. Not the army. The army was still there, still pressed against the wall, still the massive dark presence visible from the top. But the cold, the unnatural cold, the directed cold, the cold that was intention rather than weather, the cold pulled back. The temperature rose. Not to warm, to normal. The cold that was weather replacing. The cold that was attack. The Night King was recalculating. Jon saw it first. From the wall's top, watching the army, reading the movements with the specific ranger's eye that had been developed through months of intelligence operations beyond the wall. They're pulling back. The army's still there. The army's there. The others, the commanders, they're pulling back. To the tree line. There, Jon looked at the patterns. They're waiting. For what? I don't know. Jon looked at the wall, at the collapsed tunnel, at the solid ice face that now occupied the space where the gate had been. But they can't get through. The wall holds. The gate is gone. The only way through was the gate, and the gate is wall now. Mormont looked at the north. He looked at the army of the dead pressing against the base of the wall and beginning, slowly, in the specific, reluctant withdrawal of a force that had encountered a barrier it couldn't breach, to pull away. The wall holds, Mormont said. The wall holds, Ned said. For now, Jon said. For now. But for now was enough. For now meant time. Time to prepare. Time to send for more men, more dragonglass, more resources. Time to build the defense that the wall needed and that the realm had been neglecting for 8,000 years. The battle was not won. Not in the decisive, permanent way that battles were won in songs. The battle was, survived. The wall held. The gate was closed. The dead were on the other side, and the living were on this side, and the specific, fundamental purpose of the wall, to keep the dead out, was being fulfilled. The defense held. Ned stood on the wall and looked north and watched the army of the dead recede into the forest and thought, we held. Not with prophecy, not with destiny, not with the fire of dragons or the magic of ancient heroes. With ice and stone and the specific stubborn engineering of a wall that had been built by people who understood that some problems couldn't be solved and could only be contained. The wall was the containment. The wall held. Theon. What the war did. 299 AC. In Winterfell, the war created the specific opportunity that Theon Greyjoy had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. Theon was 20 and he had been a ward, a hostage. The language depended on whether the speaker was being diplomatic or honest in Winterfell for 10 years. 10 years of being the Greyjoy in a Stark household, the Iron Islander in the north, the specific cultural displacement of a boy raised by people who were not his people and who had never let him forget the not being. Robb's march south had taken the army. Robb's army had taken the men. Winterfell was not undefended but reduced. The garrison was small. The household was managed by Catelyn and Maester Luwin and the specific skeleton crew that remained when a castle's lord was at the wall and its heir was at war. Theon had been offered a choice: march south with Robb or stay at Winterfell. He chose to stay, not because of loyalty, because of calculation. The specific Greyjoy calculation that operated on different principles than Stark calculation, and that said, the mainland is at war with itself, and the Ironborn have been waiting for exactly this. Theon stayed because staying put him in Winterfell when the opportunity came, and the opportunity was, prove himself. To his father, to the Iron Islands, to the specific audience of Greyjoys and Ironborn who had spent 10 years considering Theon a hostage, and who would consider him a hero if he delivered them something. He didn't do it. This was the divergence, the specific point where Theon's story, in this version, took a different path than the version where everything went wrong. He didn't betray Winterfell. He didn't seize the castle. He didn't burn it. Because Ned was alive. Not because Ned's aliveness directly prevented the betrayal. Ned was at the wall, 800 miles north. But Ned's aliveness changed the context. In the other version, Ned was dead. The Stark family was shattered, and the specific authority structure that had kept Theon in check was gone. In this version, Ned was alive. The Stark family was strained but intact. The letters from the Wall, Ned's letters, carrying the specific Ned Stark moral weight that functioned even at a distance, the letters were present in Winterfell, read by Catelyn, discussed at the household table, maintaining the specific atmospheric authority of a man who wasn't physically present, but whose presence was maintained through the word. Theon felt the presence. He felt it the way a child felt a parent's authority, even when the parent was in another room, not through sight or sound, but through the specific psychological architecture that the parent had built over years, and that didn't collapse when the parent left because the architecture was structural, not physical. Ned's authority. The specific Ned Stark quality that said, I see you. I know what you're capable of. The good and the bad. And the seeing is not going to stop because I'm somewhere else. Theon thought about the betrayal. He thought about it the way people thought about crimes they were capable of, but that they chose not to commit, with the specific queasy awareness that the capability was there, and the choosing was work, and the work was ongoing. He chose not to. Not because he was noble. Not because the Stark values had replaced the Greyjoy values during his 10 years as a ward. Because the calculation said, Ned is alive. The Starks are intact. Betraying Winterfell against an intact Stark family is not the tactical opportunity it would be against a shattered one. The risk is too high. The odds are wrong. Greyjoy calculation. Not Stark honor. But the result was the same. Winterfell stood. Unbreached. Unburned. The castle that Ned had built his life in continued to stand while Ned stood on the wall. And the standing of both, the castle and the man, was the specific Stark continuity that the North required and that the North received because a hostage's calculation said, not today. Theon stayed in Winterfell. He trained in the yard. He ate at the table. He managed the awkward position of a man who wasn't family and not prisoner, and not anything that had a clean name, the specific liminal identity of a ward who had grown up and who was still, at 20, figuring out what the growing up had produced. He wrote to his father. The letter said, the mainland is at war. Winterfell is weakened. The opportunity exists. He didn't send it. He looked at the letter. He looked at the courtyard. At Bran climbing the walls. Bran always climbing. At Rickon running with the wolves. At the specific domestic normalcy of a household that had taken him in, and that had, despite the not being his people, been the only home he'd known for half his life. He burned the letter. The burning was not dramatic. The burning was the specific, quiet decision of a man choosing not to destroy the thing he lived in. Not because the thing was his, but because destroying it would make him into something he didn't want to be, and the not wanting was the closest Theon Greyjoy would ever come to honor. The letter burned. Winterfell stood. The aftermath. 299, 300 AC. The battle changed the realm's attention. Not immediately. The South was still at war. The Lannisters and the Starks and the Baratheons still grinding against each other in the specific military friction that civil wars produced. But the report from the Wall, Ned's report, written in the flat military language that lords understood, carrying the specific weight of a first-hand account from a man whose credibility was built on 15 years of being too honest for politics. The report shifted something. The shift was not dramatic. It was atmospheric. A change in the register of the conversations that lords had in their councils and their bedchambers, the specific recalibration that happened when an existential threat went from theoretical to confirmed in the minds of the people responsible for responding to it. Stannis sent more men. The specific Stannis response to confirmed intelligence, double the investment. 4,000 men from Dragonstone and the Stormlands, with wagon trains of dragonglass that Stannis' mining operation had been producing since Ned's first letter. Stannis was, Ned understood this now, with the clarity that distance and perspective provided, the right man for this specific crisis. Not the right man for a throne, not the right man for peacetime governance, the right man for a military emergency that required discipline and logistics, and the specific Stannis quality of doing the necessary thing without regard for the necessary thing's popularity. Robb sent more men. This was the complicated part. Robb was still in the Riverlands, still fighting Tywin, still managing the specific multi-front war that the Stark-Lannister conflict had produced. But the reports from the Wall had changed Robb's calculation. Not abandoned the Southern War, redirected it. Robb negotiated. With Tywin. Through intermediaries, through the specific diplomatic channels that Catelyn had been building since the campaign began, and that now, with the Wall's crisis providing an external pressure that superseded the internal one, produced results. The negotiation was not a peace. It was a truce. A pause. The specific military acknowledgement that both sides had a bigger problem, and that the bigger problem required the specific temporary suspension of hostilities that allowed resources to be redirected. Tywin agreed. Not because Tywin was generous or altruistic or moved by the threat from the north. Because Tywin was strategic. Tywin's calculation was, if the Wall falls, the dead come south, and the dead do not respect Lannister borders. The specific Tywin assessment of a threat to the Lannister position that was not political but physical, not manageable through gold and influence, but only manageable through steel, and the specific defensive infrastructure that the Wall represented. Tywin sent men, 5,000 Lannister soldiers, commanded by Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, the competent one, the man who executed what Tywin designed. Kevan arrived at the Wall with the Lannister force and the specific Lannister efficiency that turned the arrival into a logistical upgrade, better equipment, better supply chain. The wealth of the Westerlands applied to the Wall's defense. The Watch grew. From 5,000 to 12,000. From a skeleton crew to a force that approached the Wall's designed capacity. From an institution that had been dying for centuries to an institution that was, through the specific pressure of an existential threat, being reborn. Mormont was Lord Commander. Ned was his steward, the administrative brain behind the military operation, the man who managed the supply chain and the communications and the specific bureaucratic infrastructure that turned 12,000 men into a functional defense. Jon was First Ranger, not by election, by acclamation. The specific informal recognition that the Watch applied to men who had demonstrated competence beyond question. Jon had led the rangings, commanded the Wall's defense during the battle, organized the integration of the wildling fighters. The Watch brothers who had watched Jon work voted with their feet. When Jon gave orders, they followed. When Jon made assessments, they trusted. The acclamation was the Watch's way of recognizing what was already true. The relationship between Ned and Jon was changed, not healed. Changed, the specific post-truth architecture of two people who had rebuilt their connection on different foundations, and who were discovering that the new foundations produced a different building. They worked together. In the command structure, Ned as steward, Jon as ranger. The specific complementary pairing that Mormont had identified and that the crisis had confirmed. Ned managed the infrastructure. Jon managed the intelligence. The combination produced a command capability that the Wall hadn't had in living memory. They ate together, in the common hall, at the same table, not always. Sometimes Jon was ranging, and sometimes Ned was in the command quarters, and the schedules didn't align. But when they ate together, they sat at the same table, and the sitting was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because eating together was what Watch brothers did. Extraordinary because the two men at the table were uncle and nephew, and the nephew knew now, and the knowing had changed both of them. They talked. Not always about the big things, not always about Lyanna, about Rhaegar, about the blood and the prophecy and the specific existential weight of Jon's identity. Sometimes they talked about the Watch, about the defense, about the supply chain and the ranging schedule and the specific daily operational concerns of an institution that was managing a crisis. Sometimes they talked about the small things. "The stew is worse tonight," Ned said on an evening in late winter. "The stew is always worse. No, this is a new level. This stew has achieved something. Hob is experimenting with, I think it's turnips." "Those are not turnips. I didn't say they were good turnips. The exchange was nothing. The specific, meaningless human interaction that happened between two people who shared a table and a context and who had developed, through the sharing, the ability to be normal with each other. The normalcy was the achievement. The normalcy was what the truth had almost destroyed, and that the wall, the shared purpose, the common enemy, the specific institutional context that reduced all men to their function, had rebuilt. Jon said, on a night in the corridor after dinner, "I don't call you father anymore." Ned absorbed this. "In my head, I've been trying different words. Uncle, Ned, the man who raised me. Which one fits?" "None of them. All of them." Jon looked at him. "You're the person who taught me to hold a sword. You're the person who taught me honor. You're the person who lied to me for 15 years, and whose lying kept me alive. He stopped. "You're a category that doesn't have a word." "That's accurate." "Yeah, that's what you are. A category without a word. And I'm learning to be in the category without needing the word." Ned looked at his nephew. "Thank you." "For what?" "For the category. For being willing to build it." Jon nodded. Brief. The Jon nod. The specific, economical gesture that communicated more through its brevity than longer gestures communicated through their duration. They went to their separate quarters. The wall held. The girls. 300 AC. The truce produced the thing that Ned had been unable to produce from the black cells, his daughter's safety. The negotiation was Robb's and Catelyn's, the specific diplomatic work of two people who understood that military pressure and political leverage were both required, and that the wall crisis provided both. Robb had men on the Lannister border. The wall had Lannister men on it. The specific mutual investment that the truce represented produced the conditions for a hostage exchange that neither side could have achieved through war alone. Sansa and Arya were released, not freely, with terms. The terms were Tywin's, and the terms were hard, and the hardness was the Tywin tax on every transaction, the specific Lannister markup that ensured that nothing left the Lannister sphere of influence without Lannister profit attached. The terms included trade concessions, Lannister debts forgiven, the specific financial rearrangement that Tywin extracted from every situation, because Tywin understood that gold was the only universal currency, and that the accumulation of gold was the only permanent victory. Catelyn collected the girls at the Twins. The reunion was, Ned heard about it through letters, through the specific delayed communication of a father who was 800 miles from the event, and who was receiving the event through ink on paper, rather than through the embrace and the tears and the physical reality of holding his children. Catelyn's letter said, "They're here. They're safe. Sansa is changed. The court changed her. Not broken, sharpened. She sees things now that she didn't see before. The innocence is gone, and what's in its place is intelligence, the specific kind that survives the South. Arya is Arya. She fights. She fights with the style she learned from a Bravosi, and she fights constantly. And the fighting is the processing, and the processing is how she manages what happened to her. She's 9. She shouldn't have to manage anything. They ask about you every day. Sansa asks politely. Arya asks loudly. I tell them you're at the wall. I tell them you're doing important work. I tell them you're alive, and that the alive is what matters. I don't tell them about Jon. Not yet. That's your decision, and I respect the decision, even though The discovery is still settling, Ned. Learning that the boy I resented for 14 years was not your son but your nephew, that the coldness I carried was based on a lie you told to protect him. The learning is enormous, and the settling is going to take time. I'm angry at you. I love you. Both of those things are true, and neither is going to change, and the coexistence is what our marriage looks like now. A man at the Wall, and a woman in Winterfell, and the anger, and the love, and the children between them. Come home, if the Watch ever allows it. If the Wall allows it. Come home and see your children, and let them see you. Cat. Ned read the letter 3 times. He didn't cry. Ned Stark didn't cry. The specific northern stoicism that was both his strength and his limitation. The emotional architecture that held everything internal and that expressed the internal through action rather than display. But the not crying was work. The not crying was the specific muscular effort of a man preventing his face from doing the thing his face wanted to do, because the doing would have been in the common hall, at the table, where he was reading the letter because the privacy of his quarters was occupied by a watch brother who had taken the room during a shift rotation. Public. He went to the Wall. He climbed the 700 feet. In the dark. In the cold. The specific, brutal physical effort of climbing a wall of ice that would have killed a lesser man. And that was, for Ned, the required price of getting to the place where the grief could happen without witnesses. He stood on top. He looked south. 800 miles. Winterfell. Catelyn. The girls. Robb, Bran and Rickon. The family that he had built and that he had lost, and that was not lost. Changed. The family existed. The family was alive. The family was south of a wall that Ned would stand on for the rest of his life. He thought about Catelyn, about the letter, about I'm angry at you. I love you. The 2 sentences that described his marriage with the specific, brutal accuracy of a woman who said what she meant and who meant what she said. He thought about the girls, about Sansa, sharpened, about Arya, fighting, about the specific parental grief of knowing that your children had been through something terrible and that the something was your fault, not directly, not by action, but by the chain of decisions that started with telling the truth in King's Landing and that ended with your daughters in Cersei's custody for months while the truth's consequences worked themselves out. He thought about Jon, about the new relationship, about the category without a word. He stood on the wall and the wind cut through him, and the cold was normal cold, weather cold. The cold that the North produced naturally, and that Ned had been living in his entire life. And that was, in comparison to the unnatural cold of the army beyond the Wall, almost warm. The Wall held. The family held. Different shapes. Different architectures. Damaged. Changed. But holding. The Stark way. Not gracefully. Not elegantly. With the stubborn, grinding endurance of people who had been surviving winters for 8,000 years, and who treated personal catastrophe the same way they treated weather. You endured it. You came through. You kept going. Mormont. The Conversation. 300 AC. Mormont died in the spring. Not in battle. Not the dramatic commander's death that songs required. A fever. The specific indignity of a man who had survived 50 years of command at the Wall, dying of a fever in his bed, while the wall he'd been built to defend was intact and functional. He called for Ned. The day before. The specific awareness of a dying man who knew the dying was happening and who had business to finish before the business became impossible. The Watch needs a Lord Commander. Ned sat beside the bed. The room was hot. too hot. The fire burning large because Mormont's body was losing its ability to regulate temperature, and the loss was being compensated through external heat. The raven was on the bedpost, saying, "Corn," in a voice that sounded like it was commenting on the proceedings. The Watch will elect one. The Watch will elect Jon. Ned looked at him. Don't pretend you haven't thought about it. The boy, the man, is the best commander at the Wall. He's respected. He's competent. He holds the ranging command and the ranger's loyalty and the specific mix of authority and accessibility that commanders need. He's young. He's 20. I was 30 when they gave me the cloak, and I was too young then. Youth is a problem that solves itself. There will be opposition. Thorn. Thorn opposes everything. Thorn opposed me. Thorn will oppose the sunrise if the sunrise doesn't meet his standards. Mormont coughed, the specific productive cough of a man whose lungs were losing the argument with the infection. The election is the Watch's. I can't dictate, but I can suggest to you that the suggestion you make to the brothers is Jon. Ned looked at the dying man. And me? You stay as steward. The steward to the Lord Commander. The mind behind the command. The man who writes the letters and manages the supply chain and does the specific unglamorous work that keeps 12,000 men alive and that nobody notices when it's done well and that everybody notices when it's done badly. Mormont held his gaze. You're the best steward the Watch has had in 100 years. You're wasted as a lord. You're perfect as a steward. Ned almost laughed. The almost was significant. Ned Stark, almost laughing, was itself an event. The specific rarity of a man who had spent his life being serious, encountering something that was funny, despite the seriousness of the context. You're telling me I was a bad lord. I'm telling you that lordship uses 20% of your skills. The stewardship uses all of them. The bureaucracy, the logistics, the managing of people and resources, and the specific daily machinery of an institution. That's your gift. The lordship was the costume. The stewardship is the man. Ned sat with this. He sat with it, and he thought, he's right. The specific uncomfortable recognition of a truth that was both humbling and liberating. Ned had been a lord because his father died and his brother died, and the title fell to him. He had not chosen lordship. He had accepted it. The acceptance had been duty, not calling, and the distinction between duty and calling was the distinction between doing a thing because you had to and doing a thing because the thing fit you. The stewardship fit. I'll support Jon's election. Good. Mormont looked at the ceiling. One more thing. What? Tell the boy, tell Jon, tell him that the Watch doesn't care about blood. The Watch doesn't care about Stark or Targaryen or bastard or prince. The Watch cares about the man. And the man is... Mormont's voice was fading, the specific diminishing volume of a body that was shutting down systems in order of priority, and that had decided voice was not a priority. The man is good. I'll tell him. Good, the raven said, King. Mormont closed his eyes. He died the next morning. The Watch buried him in the way the Watch buried its dead. Fire, because the dead that were not burned could be raised. And the Watch had learned this lesson in the months since the battle, and the learning had produced the specific ritual adaptation of a funeral practice that was both practical and symbolic. The fire burned. The Watch elected Jon. The election was not unanimous. Alusa Thorn voted against, because Thorn voted against everything, and a handful of old guard brothers voted against because Jon was young, and because the old guard's objection to youth was constitutional rather than personal. But the election was decisive. 3/4 of the Watch, the rangers, the builders, the stewards, the wildling fighters who had been integrated into the Watch's structure and who voted because the Watch's new bylaws, Ned's bylaws, written in the months after the battle, allowed them to. Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, 17 years old, dark hair, grey eyes, The specific combination of Stark and Targaryen blood that had been produced by a prince and a princess and a war and a tower and a promise and a lie, and that was now standing on the wall in the black cloak of the Watch's commander, the most important person in the realm. He didn't know he was the most important person in the realm. He thought he was a Watch commander with a wall to hold. The gap between what he thought and what was true was the gap between the modest and the magnificent, and the gap was itself the thing that made him right for the job. Ned stood in the yard during the announcement. He watched his nephew, the boy he'd raised as his son, the man who was now his commander, accept the cloak and the title and the weight. He thought, Lyanna's boy, Lord Commander. He thought, not the king she might have imagined, not the prince the prophecy described. Something different. Something that the prophecy hadn't accounted for because the prophecy dealt in destiny, and Jon dealt in duty, and duty was the thing that actually held walls. He thought, I'm proud. The word was insufficient. The feeling was larger than the word. But words were what Ned had, and pride was the word that was closest, and the closeness would have to do. What if Ned Stark survived and joined the Night's Watch? He lost everything. That's the first thing. Before the wall, before the Watch, before the ranging and the battle and the wildlings and the truth, he lost everything. The name, the title, the North, the marriage, the children, the 15 years of lordship that had been his identity and that he traded for his life and his daughter's safety. He lost it on the steps of the Sept of Baelor. He confessed to a crime he didn't commit, and the confession stripped him bare, and the stripping was the price, and he paid it, because the alternative was his head and his daughters, and the specific, irreversible catastrophe that would have been produced by one more Stark death. He went to the wall. He went in a cage, on a wagon, past the castle he'd built his life in, to an institution that was designed for men who had nothing left. He arrived with nothing. No title, no lands, no family, no name. Just Ned Stark, the man underneath the Lord, the person who remained when the costume was removed. And the person was useful, not the lordly useful, not the hand of the king useful, the specific, mundane, unglamorous useful of a man who could manage a supply chain and write a letter and organize 12,000 men into a functional defense. The stewards useful, the administrators useful, the useful that nobody celebrated because celebrating the useful was like celebrating breathing, essential, invisible, noticed only in its absence. He found Jon. He found his nephew on the wall, and he told him the truth, the 15-year truth, the Lyanna truth, the Rhaegar truth, and the telling broke something and repaired something, and the breaking and the repairing were the same event. Jon forgave him, not because the lie was right, because the lie was necessary. And the necessity and the wrongness coexisted, and the coexistence was the shape of their relationship going forward. A man who had lied, and a man who had been lied to, sitting at the same table, eating terrible stew, and finding in the terrible stew, and the shared purpose, and the common enemy, a new version of the thing they'd always been. Not father and son. Something else, a category without a word. The wall held. That's the second thing. The wall held, not through prophecy, not through destiny, not through the specific mystical mechanisms that the stories described, through ice and stone and dragon glass, and the 12,000 men who stood on the wall and looked north and held. Ned was one of those men, not the most important one, not the commander, not the hero, not the figure that the songs would center, the steward, the man who made sure the dragon glass was distributed and the food was adequate, and the letters were sent, and the supply chain functioned. The invisible man, the essential man. Jon was the commander. Jon, the bastard who was not a bastard. the Stark, who was a Targaryen, the Watcher, who became the leader. Jon held the wall the way the wall held the north, through endurance and duty and the specific, stubborn refusal to yield that was both ice and fire, both Stark and Targaryen, both the patience of the north and the intensity of the blood. Father and son, uncle and nephew, commander and steward. They held the wall together. Not because of destiny, because a man lost everything and went to the wall and found in the losing the specific, reduced clarity of a person who had been stripped to the essential and who discovered that the essential was enough. Ned Stark at the wall, the lord who became a steward, the hand who became a brother, the father who became an uncle, and the wall held. The wall held because the wall was built for this, not for the dead alone, but for the men who stood on it. The specific combination of ice and purpose that the wall represented was not the ice itself, but the people who maintained the ice. And the people were broken, exiled, sentenced, stripped, reduced, and from the reduction, rebuilt. Into the thing the wall needed, into the thing the realm needed, into brothers. The wall held